Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. After earning my pilot's license, I managed to land myself a pretty cushy job flying for a major airline. The pay was fantastic, more money than I'd ever made in my life. The hours weren't too bad, and my girlfriend at the time thought I looked great in my fitted uniform and aviator shades. People thought I was having the time of my life. They'd see me in airports pulling my small carry-on behind me and assume I was living some glamorous dream. But the truth was, I hated it. I hated the structure, the constant scrutiny, how polished but ultimately phony everything about the airline business was. I hated the corporate meetings where we discussed passenger experience optimization, when what they really meant was cramming more seats into less space. I hated paying an obscene amount of money to rent a small apartment in a city I barely visited, a place that never felt like home because I was gone more than I was there. The walls were bare because what was the point of decorating when I'd only see them a few days a month? So one day in late 2017, I shocked everyone by quitting. I didn't just quit with nothing lined up. I'm not completely reckless. I'd found another job before I handed in my 3 months' notice. It's just that the new job happened to involve moving up to Alaska to be a bush pilot, flying supplies and passengers to remote locations where roads didn't exist and civilization was just a concept. My girlfriend thought I was crazy. We had a massive fight one night in that empty apartment, her voice echoing off the bare walls as she listed all the reasons I was making the biggest mistake of my life. We broke up not long after, and honestly, it was probably for the best. She wanted stability, a white picket fence, Sunday brunches. I wanted something I couldn't even name yet. About a month later, after selling off or giving away like half of the stuff I owned, I flew up to Alaska and out to the little airfield that would become my new workplace. It was a far cry from the massive international airports I was used to. Just a small runway carved out of the wilderness, a weathered hangar, and a tiny office that looked like it had been built in the 1950s and never updated. I stayed in a cabin just a short walk from the airfield, and when I first saw it that evening as the sun was setting, my heart sank. The place was so run down that for a moment, standing there with my duffel bag in hand, I wondered if I'd actually made a terrible mistake. The cabin looked like it had been abandoned for years. The wood was gray and weathered, several windows were cracked, and the front porch sagged dangerously to one side. Inside was worse. The floorboards creaked with every step, and several felt soft enough that I worried about putting my full weight on them. There was a thick layer of dust on everything, and the air smelled of mildew and something else I couldn't identify, something organic and slightly rotten. The furniture that came with the place consisted of a lumpy bed with a stained mattress, a rickety table, and a chair that wobbled when I tested it. The kitchenette had an ancient stove that I wasn't entirely sure still worked, and when I turned on the faucet, the water came out rust brown. That first night was rough. I lay on that questionable mattress, wrapped in my sleeping bag because I didn't trust the bedding, listening to unfamiliar sounds. The wind moved through the trees with a low moan. Something scratched at the outside walls, probably just branches, I told myself. Animals moved through the underbrush nearby. Every noise made me tense, my eyes snapping open in the darkness. But then I made a trip over to Fairbanks the next day to pick up some groceries and home improvement supplies. Over the following week, I threw myself into renovating the cabin. I replaced the worst of the floorboards, patched the roof, cleaned every surface until my hands were raw, and brought in new bedding, curtains, and even a decent coffee maker. I fixed the sagging porch, replaced the cracked windows, and gave the whole place a fresh coat of paint inside. Slowly, the cabin started to feel a little more like home, and I remembered why the whole thing had seemed like a good idea in the first place. It was peaceful in a way that the city never was. There was no traffic noise, no sirens, no neighbors fighting through thin walls, just the wind in the trees and the occasional call of a bird. I got to set my own schedule, wake up when I wanted, go to bed when I felt like it. Some of my passengers ended up being incredibly interesting people. Researchers studying wildlife, geologists mapping the terrain, old-timers who'd been living in the bush for decades and had stories that would make your hair stand on end. There was something about living wild that felt good for my soul. I'm not about to get poetic on you, but there's no other way to describe it. Every morning I'd wake up to sunlight filtering through the trees, make my coffee, and step out onto that porch I'd fixed with my own hands. The air up there was different, cleaner somehow, so crisp it almost hurt to breathe in deeply. Life was good, but that didn't mean there wasn't turbulence here and there. I had trouble in the air on more than one occasion. There was the time my engine started making a grinding noise halfway to a remote research station, and I had to nurse the plane down to a barely adequate landing strip with my heart hammering in my chest the entire descent. There was the day I hit unexpected turbulence so severe that I thought the wings might tear off, the plane bucking and dropping like a stone before catching air again. I had encounters with wildlife that made me realize just how vulnerable humans really are. There was the moose that charged my cabin one evening, a massive bull that decided my porch was in his territory. I watched from the window as he demolished my woodpile, his enormous antlers swinging back and forth. There was the grizzly I spotted from the air, standing on its hind legs and easily 8 feet tall, pawing at a tree. And there was the wolf pack I saw one winter evening, their eyes reflecting my flashlight as they stood at the edge of the clearing, watching my cabin with an intelligence that was unsettling. I saw one or two things from the air that I'd never be able to fully explain. Strange patterns in the snow that looked almost deliberate. An abandoned settlement that wasn't on any map I had. The buildings slowly being reclaimed by the forest. Once I swear I saw a person standing alone in the middle of a frozen lake, miles from anywhere. But when I circled back, they were gone. And this is the story of just one of them, the one that still keeps me up at night. It was early May of 2018, and I was making what should have been a pretty routine flight. I was taxiing a couple of researchers from one location to another, both of them biologists studying migration patterns of caribou, if I remember correctly. They were pleasant enough company, chatting about their work in the back of my small plane, occasionally pointing out something interesting on the ground below. I'd been in the air for about 2 hours already, flying under superb weather conditions for the spring. The sky was clear, visibility was perfect, and there was hardly any wind. It was the kind of flying weather that makes you remember why you got into aviation in the first place. The landscape below was breathtaking, an endless expanse of forest stretching to the horizon, broken up by rivers that gleamed like silver threads in the sunlight. The ground beneath was a carpet of trees, spruce and pine mostly, their dark green broken up by the lighter green of birch and aspen just starting to leaf out. Every so often there'd be a clearing, some large, some smaller. Most were completely bare except for the occasional rogue tree that had somehow taken root in the open space. Then something down below suddenly caught my eye. At first, I almost dismissed it. Just another clearing, nothing special. But something about it nagged at me. I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was, but my gut told me to pay attention. I looked again, banking the plane slightly to get a better view. The clearing was roughly circular, maybe 50 yards across. And there, near the center, was a row of what looked like saplings all standing in a perfect line. It struck me as an odd sight among all that wilderness. Nature doesn't do straight lines. Trees grow where seeds fall, following no particular pattern. This was deliberate, geometric, human. Since there are few straight lines in nature, I knew there was a good chance it was man-made. Maybe someone had planted them as part of some reforestation project. Or maybe they were markers for a property line. But who would be marking property lines this far out in the middle of nowhere? The researchers were still talking in the back, oblivious to what I was seeing. I didn't want to alarm them, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. My hands felt clammy on the controls, and I realized my heartbeat had picked up. As I got closer and ended up passing the clearing with it on my left, I looked out the window and got a better view. They weren't saplings at all. They were too uniform, too straight. The color was wrong too, not the brown-green of young trees, but something paler, almost bleached looking. They were crosses, large wooden crosses, planted in the ground. My mouth went dry. Who puts crosses in the middle of nowhere? A memorial, maybe, for someone who died out here. But why so many? And why in such a remote location? I banked left, turning so I could pass the clearing a second time at a lower altitude. You don't see stuff like that out in the middle of nowhere. And I guess curiosity got the better of me. I told myself I was being silly, that there was probably a perfectly reasonable explanation, but I needed to see for myself. Just checking something out. I called back to the researchers, keeping my voice level. Thought I saw something interesting. Coming up on the clearing again, I dropped altitude. Maybe 200 feet lower than before. I could see them more clearly now. Yes, definitely crosses. Big ones too. Maybe 10 or 12 feet tall. Made of what looked like rough-hewn timber. There were 7 of them in total, spaced about 10 feet apart in a perfect line. But it was only when I flew directly overhead, low enough that I could see details, that my entire body went cold. There were people attached to those crosses. Not nailed, I realized with a sick feeling in my stomach, but tied. Heavy ropes bound their arms to the cross beams, their bodies hanging forward against the restraints. Some were completely still, their heads hanging down. I couldn't tell from this distance if they were unconscious or dead. God, I hoped they were unconscious. But others were moving. Writhing, actually. I could see their bodies twisting against the ropes, their heads moving from side to side. Even from the air I could sense their desperation, their agony. One of them was thrashing so violently that I could see the cross itself shaking. They were almost camouflaged from a distance. Their clothes, what remained of them anyway, were dark and tattered, blending in with the weathered wood. That's why I'd almost missed them, why they'd looked like saplings from farther away. How long had they been there? Hours, days. My hands were shaking on the controls. I felt bile rise in my throat. This was wrong. This was so fundamentally wrong that my brain was having trouble processing what I was seeing. Things like this didn't happen. This was Alaska in 2018, not medieval Europe. This was the modern world. This couldn't be real. But it was real. I'd seen it with my own eyes. I didn't take another pass. I couldn't. My whole body was trembling, and I needed to get myself back on course before the researchers noticed something was wrong. I pulled the plane up and to the right, putting the clearing behind me. My mind was racing. What did I just see? Who were those people? How did they get there? Who did this to them? I hit my radio, trying to raise anyone within range. My voice came out steadier than I felt. This is November 724 Victor Papa. Does anyone copy? Static. Then more static. Then finally, a crackle and a voice. This is Northern Timber Camp. We copy you. 4 Victor Papa. Thank God. Northern Timber. I need you to get in touch with the Wilderness Search and Rescue. I've spotted what looks like people in distress about 40 miles south of your position. There was a pause. What kind of distress? I hesitated. If I told him the truth, he'd think I was crazy. He'd probably wonder if I was drunk or high. And even if he believed me by the time rescue got there, how much time would have passed? Would those people still be alive? Looks like some campers who might be in trouble, I finally said. I couldn't get a good look, but something seemed off. Can you get search and rescue out there? Sure thing. 4 Victor Papa. We'll get on the horn. Can you give me coordinates? I rattled off the coordinates, my voice mechanical. The guy at the logging camp said he'd contact search and rescue right away, and I thanked him, then switched off the radio. I left to make the rest of the flight with nothing but my thoughts and theories to keep me company. What had I just witnessed? Was it some kind of cult activity? Some twisted punishment? Were they put there to die, left for exposure and dehydration to take them? Or was it something else? Something I couldn't even imagine. I didn't mention anything to the researchers. What would I say? They continued their conversation about caribou migration patterns and population dynamics, completely unaware of the horror I just witnessed. Their company was actually a huge relief because it kept my mind from spiraling into darker and darker places. But on that last leg of the flight, when I dropped them off and was flying solo back to the airfield, I was alone with my thoughts again. The sun was starting to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that seemed obscenely beautiful given what I'd seen. I started thinking that maybe all that solitude and isolation was getting to me. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe stress or fatigue had made me see something that wasn't there. But I knew I hadn't imagined it. The image was burned into my brain. Those crosses, those writhing bodies, that sense of absolute wrongness. When I landed, I immediately radioed my boss, Tom, on the long-range radio I had in my cabin. My hands were still shaking as I held the microphone. I told him about what I'd seen, or rather what I thought I might have seen out there in the wilderness. I tried to keep my voice steady, professional, but I'm sure he could hear the strain. There was a long pause. Then he said, "Take a week off. Fly back to Fairbanks tomorrow. Stay in town for a bit. I'm fine, I protested. I just needed to tell someone. That's not a request, he said, his voice gentle but firm. You need some human contact. Trust me on this. So I did. The next day I flew to Fairbanks, and Tom met me for dinner at a little restaurant that served massive steaks and loaded baked potatoes. The place was warm and loud, full of people talking and laughing, the clatter of silverware on plates, classic rock playing on a jukebox in the corner. It was exactly what I needed. We didn't talk about the crosses right away. We talked about the job, about life, about nothing in particular. Tom had been flying in Alaska for 30 years, and he had a weathered, lived-in face that told stories all on its own. He was good company, the kind of person who listened more than he talked. But eventually, over coffee after our meal, he brought it up. So, the crosses. I nodded, stirring sugar into my cup, even though I didn't take sugar. Just needed something to do with my hands. Search and rescue went out there, he said. My head snapped up. And? Didn't find anything. No crosses, no people, just an empty clearing. The coffee turned sour in my stomach. That's impossible. I saw them. I flew low enough to see people moving on those crosses. I believe you, Tom said, and there was something in his voice that made me think he really did. But they're gone now. Either someone moved them, or... He trailed off, leaving the other possibilities hanging in the air. We sat in silence for a moment. Then Tom leaned back in his chair and said something I never forgot. You know, people think Florida is the weirdest state in the Union, and maybe out of the lower 48 it is. But of all the places I've ever lived, Alaska takes the cake for sheer weirdness. He took a sip of his coffee, his eyes distant. It's not just all the people who've gone missing over the years either. It's the people who haven't gone missing. The ones who moved up here to get away from things, from society, from the law, from their past. People like you, I guess, though you're running toward something, not away from it. I wanted to protest that comparison, but he continued. Most of them, they just want to be left alone so they can live how they want. And we leave them alone. That's the unspoken rule up here. You don't ask too many questions. You don't poke your nose where it doesn't belong. Because some of the things people get up to when they think nobody's watching. He shook his head. Sometimes it's better not to know. But those people might have been part of something, he said quietly. Some religious group, some survivalist cult. Who knows? Might have been volunteers in some extreme ritual. Might have been prisoners of someone twisted enough to do something like that. Point is, they're gone now. And you did what you could by reporting it. I flew back out to the bush after that week. Back to my little cabin that I'd fixed up with my own hands. I went back to flying passengers and cargo to remote locations. Life continued. But I never forgot those crosses. I never forgot the sight of those people bound to them. Some still, some moving in what must have been unbearable pain. Late at night when the wind howls through the trees and I'm alone with my thoughts, I wonder about them. Who were they? Did they survive? Did search and rescue really find nothing? Or did they find something they were told to keep quiet about? I hope, God, I hope it was part of some voluntary religious reenactment, some extreme passion play where those people were up there of their own free will and lived to tell the tale, that they were taken down shortly after I flew over, that they went home to warm beds and hot meals and families who loved them. Because the alternative, thinking they were put up there to die slowly, to suffer in isolation where nobody would hear their screams, is almost too horrible to think about. But I do think about it. I think about it more than I'd like to admit. And sometimes, when I'm flying over the wilderness, and I spot a clearing below, my hands tighten on the controls and I force myself not to look too closely. Because some things, once you've seen them, you can never unsee. Some knowledge, once gained, becomes a weight you carry forever. The Alaska wilderness keeps its secrets well, and maybe, as Tom suggested, sometimes it's better that way. But those crosses, those people, they're my secret now too, burned into my memory. A reminder that civilization is just a thin veneer, and beyond its borders humans are capable of things that defy explanation, things that make you question everything you thought you knew about the world. I still fly these routes. I still love the freedom, the solitude, the raw beauty of Alaska, but I fly with different eyes now, always wondering what other horrors might be hidden in those endless miles of wilderness. waiting for someone to fly low enough, at just the right angle, to see what shouldn't be seen. When you spend enough time alone in the wilderness, you learn the difference between ordinary silence and the kind of quiet that warns you something's wrong. It's a silence that settles over you slowly, the kind you don't notice until you realize you've stopped breathing just to hear better. My name's Jason Weller, and 2 years ago I resigned as a backcountry ranger at Zion National Park after an accident that I still don't talk about. These days I earn a living writing about solitude in wild places. My editor had given me a simple assignment: write about authentic wilderness experience. No technology, no safety nets. Authentic, unfiltered, and completely analog. No GPS, no cameras, no electronics. Just maps, journals, and intuition. This time, my assignment was to tackle the Grandview Trail on the south rim of the Grand Canyon. It was late November, well past the tourist season, and the canyon was nearly deserted. Perfect for the kind of article I had in mind. Raw, isolated, real. On my first day down from the rim, I remembered why few hikers venture onto the Grandview Trail. It drops fast, too fast for comfort, switchbacking sharply through crumbling rock and loose gravel. The wooden trailhead sign, weathered and splintered, had warned, "Unmaintained path, proceed with caution." I'd been warned about worse. My boots slid and skidded, kicking up dust and sending loose stones bouncing away into nothingness. Each step felt like a negotiation with gravity. The trail hadn't seen maintenance in years, maybe decades. Sections had simply eroded away, leaving gaps where I had to stretch across empty air, my fingers clinging to whatever handholds I could find in the fractured limestone. The rock here was ancient, layered in bands of rust red and ochre that told stories millions of years old. But beneath the geological wonder there was something else, an absence of life that struck me as unusual even for November. No birds called, no insects buzzed. Even the wind seemed to avoid this particular stretch of canyon, as if the air itself had learned to move around it rather than through it. I paused briefly to look back up at the rim above, a sheer wall rising into the sky. Already I felt small, reduced to something insignificant against the vast indifference of stone and sky. The sun hung low, casting long shadows that turned the canyon walls into something primordial and unknowable. By sunset, I'd made it down to Horseshoe Mesa. My legs trembled with exhaustion, muscles burning from the constant strain of descent. I picked a spot close to a rust-colored rock wall, sheltered just enough to block the cold wind blowing up from below. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees in the last hour, and my breath now formed small clouds in the dimming light. My camp came together quickly, tent staked out, stove and fuel canisters set carefully to one side, map folded neatly by my sleeping bag. But as I worked, an uncomfortable awareness crept over me. The sensation of being watched is primitive, hardwired into our brains from when we were prey as often as predator. I kept turning, scanning the surrounding cliffs and rock formations. Nothing, just empty space and darkening sky. I ate without thinking, distracted by the canyon's shifting shadows. The freeze-dried meal tasted like cardboard, but I forced it down, knowing I'd need the calories. As darkness fell completely, the temperature plummeted. I could see my breath clearly now, thick white plumes that dissipated slowly in the still air. The stars emerged with startling clarity, thousands of them scattered across the black expanse above. In different circumstances, it would have been beautiful. Instead, it felt exposing, as if those distant points of light were eyes, watching, waiting. Exhaustion set in fast, pulling me under before I'd even finished my journal entry. I wrote only 3 lines. Day 1. Made it to Horseshoe Mesa. Something feels wrong here. The pen slipped from my fingers as consciousness faded. I woke hours later. My watch read 2:15 a.m., the numbers glowing faintly green in the absolute darkness. I blinked, unsure at first what had startled me awake. My heart was already racing, adrenaline flooding my system before my conscious mind had even identified the threat. Then it came again. The sound of something breathing just beyond the thin nylon fabric of my tent. Not the quick animal-like breath I'd come to recognize in my years as a ranger. I knew what bears sounded like, what mountain lions sounded like, what deer and elk and even mice sounded like when they investigated campsites. This was none of those. It was slow, calm, Measured, almost human, but not quite. The rhythm was slightly off, like someone consciously trying to breathe but having to think about each inhale and exhale. I sat upright, every muscle tightening, ears straining against the darkness. The fabric of my sleeping bag rustled loudly in the silence, and immediately, the breathing outside stopped. For 10 seconds, maybe 15, there was nothing. Then it resumed, exactly as before, slow, deliberate, wrong. My hand found the knife I kept by my sleeping bag, fingers wrapping around the handle with desperate force. The breathing continued for another 20 or 30 seconds, never changing pace, never moving closer or farther away. Just there, constant and inexplicable. Then, as abruptly as it had started, it ceased. I sat frozen, knife clutched in my hand. Listening so intently my ears began to ring. Minutes passed, 5, then 10. Nothing but silence and the occasional whisper of wind against the tent fabric. Finally, I reached for my headlamp with trembling fingers. The zipper of the tent opening sounded impossibly loud as I pulled it down, each tooth of the zipper clicking like a gunshot in the quiet. The tent flap opened, revealing the stark emptiness of the night. I shone my light around the camp in a slow arc. Sleeping bag, pack, stove. Everything seemed exactly as I'd left it. Except, my right glove lay near the fire ring, 20 feet from where I remembered setting it down inside the tent vestibule. I stared at it, my mind racing through possibilities. Could I have dropped it earlier without noticing? Had I actually put it inside the vestibule, or was that just what I remembered? Memory is unreliable, especially when you're tired. Maybe the wind had caught it somehow, though the night air was completely still now. Cold anxiety settled in my stomach, but I forced logic back into my mind. I was overtired, spooked by the unfamiliar surroundings and the isolation. The breathing had probably been wind channeling through the rocks in some strange way. The glove had fallen out when I'd gotten into the tent. There were rational explanations for everything. I crawled out of the tent, my bare feet touching the cold ground, and retrieved the glove. The ground was frigid, almost painful against my skin. I scanned the area with my headlamp one more time, then retreated into the tent, zipping it up quickly. My brain spun excuses as I pulled my sleeping bag tighter around my body. You're fine. Everything's fine. Just the wind. Just your imagination. Just
I got it.
But somewhere deeper, in a part of my mind that still remembered what it was like to be prey, a voice whispered, "Run." Sleep returned uneasily, filled with half-formed dreams of breathing and footsteps and eyes watching from the dark. When dawn arrived, pale and reluctant, I lay in my sleeping bag for several minutes listening. The quality of light seeping through the tent fabric was gray and weak, suggesting heavy cloud cover. No bird songs greeted the morning. No sounds at all except the faint moan of wind across distant stone. I dressed slowly, delaying the moment when I'd have to leave the relative security of the tent. Finally, I unzipped the flap and stepped outside. The camp had changed. I stood motionless, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. My fuel canister had been disconnected from the stove and now lay neatly atop a flat rock 3 feet away. Not dropped, not knocked over. Placed. The precision of it made my skin crawl. The map I distinctly remembered leaving folded inside my tent was now tucked under my sleeping pad, edges perfectly aligned as if someone had used a ruler to ensure it was exactly centered. And on top of my pack, folded with military precision, were my extra socks, side by side, perfectly parallel. Someone had been here. Someone had been in my camp, handling my things, rearranging them with methodical care. And I had heard nothing except the breathing. I dropped to my knees, scanning the dust around my campsite desperately for tracks. There had to be footprints, some evidence of who or what had done this. The ground was soft enough that my own boot prints from the previous evening were clearly visible, but there was nothing else clear, nothing identifiable, just loose dirt and scattered stones, and my own tracks leading to and from the tent. How was that possible? How could someone enter my camp, move my belongings, organize them with such precision, and leave no traces? My hands shook as I examined the ground more closely, looking for any disturbance I might have missed. There, a vague depression in the dust near where my fuel canister had been moved. But it was smudged, indistinct, useless for identification. The canyon walls loomed silently above me, indifferent and unmoving. The morning light did nothing to warm them. If anything, they seemed colder, more hostile than they had the previous evening. My hands still trembling, I grabbed my journal and wrote quickly, my fingers leaving smudges on the page. This doesn't feel like my camp anymore. Someone was here. Someone touched my things. I underlined the words twice, then added, "No tracks." How is there no tracks? The words stared back at me from the page, heavy and dark. Reading them made the situation feel more real, more immediate. I closed the journal with a tight snap and shoved it deep into my pack. Already I felt the canyon changing around me. Or perhaps I was changing, my perception warping under the weight of isolation and fear. It was subtle, a tug, a whisper of uncertainty, but unmistakably present. The rational part of my brain, the ranger who had spent years in the backcountry, who had handled emergencies and dangerous situations with calm professionalism, that part of me wanted to pack up and leave immediately. But another part, perhaps the writer, perhaps just the stubborn core of who I was, refused to be chased away so easily. There had to be an explanation. Someone else was camping in the area. Someone who had stumbled upon my site and had a very strange sense of humor. Or maybe I was more exhausted than I realized, and had rearranged these things myself in some fugue state during the night. Even as I thought these explanations, I knew they were hollow. I knew what I'd seen, what I'd heard, and I knew with a certainty that bypassed logic entirely that something was deeply wrong. I packed up quickly and quietly, glancing around too often. There were no signs of life, no evidence of other visitors, yet I felt eyes somewhere, watching me. Not constantly, but in flickers. Brief moments when the weight of observation pressed against my awareness, then vanished before I could locate its source. The canyon stretched before me, vast and ancient, and completely indifferent to my fear. It was no longer just a wilderness trip for an article. It had become something else entirely, though I didn't yet understand what. It was only the first morning, and already I knew I should leave. But I didn't. God help me, I didn't. The deeper I moved into the canyon, the more acute my awareness became. Every sound, the scrape of my boots on stone, the rattle of gear in my pack, my own breathing seemed amplified, echoing off walls that rose hundreds of feet above me. Between these sounds, the silence pressed in, heavy and expectant. I felt eyes on me. Not constantly, more like flickers at the edges of my awareness. Brief moments that made me glance back over my shoulder. Nothing was ever there when I looked. Just silent stretches of rock and shadowed crevices. The rational explanations I'd constructed during the morning were already crumbling. You can't rationalize a feeling that lives in your bones, in the ancient parts of your brain that evolved to detect predators. By midday, the switchbacks tightened into steep zigzags along the cliffside. My thighs burned as I climbed, lungs tight from the thin, dry air. Sweat soaked through my shirt despite the cold, and I could taste salt and dust with every breath. The trail here was particularly treacherous, barely 2 feet wide in places, with sheer drops on one side and vertical rock face on the other. I reached an exposed ledge, deciding to stop for water and check my map. My hands trembled slightly as I unscrewed the cap of my water bottle from exertion, I told myself, though I knew that wasn't entirely true. The sun hammered down despite the late November date, reflected and magnified by the surrounding stone until the heat felt almost physical. I shielded my eyes, squinting across the vast emptiness to the cliff face opposite mine. The canyon here was perhaps half a mile wide, the far wall a mirror image of towering stone and geological layers. Then I saw it. On a narrow shelf about 400 feet away stood a figure. At first I thought it might be a dead tree, or perhaps a rock formation that happened to resemble a human shape. The human mind is excellent at finding patterns, at seeing faces and figures in random arrangements of shadow and stone. But as my eyes adjusted, as I focused on that distant shelf, the unmistakable reality of what I was seeing solidified. It was a person, tall and slender, standing rigidly still, arms relaxed at their sides, too still. No one stands that motionless, not even when trying to. There's always some slight movement, weight shifting from foot to foot, head turning to scan the surroundings, hands adjusting position. This figure had none of that. It stood with the stillness of stone. I raised a hand in a hesitant wave, the gesture feeling absurd even as I made it. No response. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge me in any way. My heart began to pound harder. I lowered my hand slowly, and in that exact moment, delayed by perhaps 2 seconds, the figure raised its hand. Unease tightened in my chest, making it hard to breathe. This wasn't a simple wave returned. It was a mirror image, the timing too precise to be coincidence, too delayed to be natural. I shifted my weight to my left foot, watching intently. The figure shifted its weight to its left foot. That same 2-second delay. I tilted my head to the left, my neck cracking slightly with the movement. The figure tilted its head to the left. My throat went dry. This wasn't another hiker. This was something else. Something that watched and imitated with mechanical precision. I could feel my pulse in my ears now, each heartbeat distinct and rapid. Without taking my eyes off the figure, I slowly stepped back until the cliff edge obscured it from view. For several long minutes I leaned against the stone wall, breathing hard, fighting the panic that threatened to overwhelm me. My hands shook so badly I had to clasp them together to keep from dropping my water bottle. What I'd just seen violated something fundamental about reality, about how people behave. The delayed mimicry, the perfect stillness. It was wrong on a level that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to primal fear. Eventually driven by a need to know, to understand, I mustered the courage to look again. I edged forward carefully, peering around the rock that blocked my view. The shelf was empty, but that brought no relief. Instead, a new fear took hold. If the figure wasn't on the shelf anymore, where was it? Was it moving? Was it coming closer? I scanned the opposite cliff face frantically, looking for any sign of movement or human presence. Nothing. Then I looked down at my feet. Fresh boot prints marked the dust of the ledge where I stood, leading to the very edge. Large prints, oddly elongated, pointing toward the direction I'd been heading. I knelt down, examining them more closely. The tread pattern was similar to my own boots, but not identical, and they were fresh. I could see where individual grains of dust had been displaced, still settling. Someone had stood exactly where I was standing. Probably within the last few minutes, while I'd been focused on the figure across the canyon. Someone had approached from behind, had stood close enough to touch me, then had moved on. My stomach lurched. I spun around, scanning the trail I'd just climbed. Empty. I looked ahead toward where the trail continued. Also empty. Yet those prints were real, tangible evidence that someone or something had been here. I stood there on that exposed ledge for nearly 20 minutes, paralyzed by indecision. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to climb out of this canyon as fast as possible and never return. But another part of me, perhaps foolish, perhaps just too proud to admit defeat, insisted there had to be a rational explanation. Another hiker, someone playing a cruel joke. Or maybe the isolation and exhaustion were making me paranoid, making me see things that weren't there. The mind is capable of incredible self-deception when stressed. I'd seen it before in lost hikers, in people who'd been alone too long, the way reality could bend and warp under the weight of solitude and fear. But those boot prints were real. I could reach down and touch them, see the clear outline of a sole pattern in the dust. Finally, as the sun began its descent toward the western rim, I forced myself to continue forward. The alternative, climbing back out, meant admitting defeat, meant acknowledging that something had frightened me badly enough to abandon my assignment. My pride wouldn't allow that, not yet. As I hiked, I found myself talking out loud, narrating my actions in a steady stream of words that filled the oppressive silence. Step over this rock. Watch the loose gravel. Check the map. Drink some water. The sound of my own voice provided some small comfort, proof that I still existed, that I was still capable of affecting my environment. But occasionally, very faintly, I thought I heard an echo. My own words, repeated back to me from somewhere distant. Just fragments, loose gravel, or drink some water, coming from no identifiable direction. Each time I stopped to listen more carefully, the echoes ceased, leaving only the vast silence of stone and sky. That night, I chose my campsite with paranoid care. I found a shallow ravine, its walls close enough to provide some sense of security. The space was cramped, barely large enough for my tent, but that was exactly what I wanted. Anything approaching would have to come from one of two directions, and both were visible from my tent entrance. I worked methodically, anxiety making every action deliberate and precise. I arranged rocks protectively around the perimeter of my camp, not because they would stop anything, but because any disturbance of them would be immediately obvious. I hoisted my bear bag extra high on a strong tree limb, using every bit of rope I had to keep it well out of reach. As I worked, the sun disappeared behind the western rim, and shadows flooded the ravine with startling speed. The temperature dropped precipitously, and within minutes I was shivering despite my jacket. My breath formed thick clouds that hung in the still air. I ate quickly, forcing down food I didn't want, then retreated into my tent. Darkness descended fast, complete and absolute. There was no moon, and the stars, though bright, provided almost no illumination down in the ravine. I lay in my sleeping bag, fully dressed, knife within easy reach, listening. The night sounds of the canyon were minimal. Occasional gusts of wind would moan through distant rock formations, creating sounds that were almost musical, almost like voices. I told myself it was just wind, just the natural acoustics of the landscape, but my body remained tense, every muscle coiled, ready to react. Sleep seemed impossible. I lay awake, my eyes wide in the darkness, listening to the faint hiss of wind through dry scrub. My body was exhausted from the day's hiking, yet I was hyper-alert, waiting, listening. I checked my watch every few minutes, watching the glowing numbers advance with agonizing slowness. 11:47 p.m. At exactly 12:40 a.m., footsteps crunched through the gravel nearby. I froze completely, even stopping my breathing. The steps were slow, deliberate, human steps, not the padding of animal paws or the scuttle of smaller creatures, but the unmistakable sound of boots on gravel. Each step was distinct, measured, approaching from the eastern end of the ravine. I lay perfectly still, gripping my knife so hard my knuckles throbbed. My heart pounded violently, so loud I was certain it could be heard outside the tent. The footsteps continued, growing closer. 10 feet away, then 5. The steps halted only a few yards from my tent. Silence. I waited, every nerve screaming. Seconds stretched into a minute. The silence was somehow worse than the footsteps had been. At least movement implied intention, purpose. This stillness suggested watching, waiting, considering. Then a voice spoke, low, quiet, and perfectly calm. My voice. "Stay awake," it said. "Stay awake." A wave of nausea surged through me. Sweat pooled along my spine despite the cold. The voice was mine, not similar to mine, not an imitation, but exactly mine. The same cadence, the same slight rasp I had from years of smoking in my 20s. The same way I dropped the ends of words slightly. But I hadn't spoken. My jaw was clenched tight. My throat closed with fear. The voice repeated with the exact same inflection. "Stay awake. Stay awake." I fought the urge to open the tent, to see what stood outside. Some deep, primal part of my brain understood that seeing what spoke with my voice would break something fundamental in my mind. There are some things human consciousness isn't meant to process, some violations of reality that cause permanent damage. Instead, I fumbled in the dark for my journal, forcing my shaking fingers to grip a pen. Eyes wide, staring at nothing in the absolute darkness of the tent, I scribbled blindly onto the paper. The pen caught and skipped on the page, but I kept writing, repeating the only words I could think of. "It's not me. It's not me. It's not me. It's not me." I filled an entire page, then another, the words becoming less legible as my hand cramped and trembled. The act of writing anchored me somehow, gave me something to focus on besides the voice and the presence just outside my tent. The voice didn't speak again. The footsteps moved no closer, nor did they retreat. They simply lingered, motionless, just beyond the canvas of my shelter. I could sense the presence there, patient and unwavering, waiting for something. Hours passed. I kept writing, filling page after page with the same phrase, slight variations. Anything to keep my mind occupied and away from the edge of panic. "It's not me. Not me. Can't be me. I'm here. It's not me." My watch read 3:15 a.m. when the presence finally withdrew. I didn't hear footsteps retreating. The departure was more felt than heard. A sudden absence of pressure. A lifting of weight I hadn't fully realized was there. The air felt different, less charged, less aware. But I didn't relax. I continued lying rigid in my sleeping bag, knife clutched in one hand, journal in the other, waiting for dawn. Dawn took forever to arrive, weak sunlight finally spilling over the horizon and seeping through my tent fabric with agonizing slowness. The light turned from black to deep blue to gray to pale yellow, and only when I could see clearly did I finally allow myself to move. My muscles had cramped from lying in the same position for so long. I groaned involuntarily as I tried to sit up, my back and shoulders screaming in protest. My hand still clutched the knife, fingers locked in position, and I had to consciously force them to release. Trembling, I pushed the tent flap open and stepped outside, knife still clutched in my other hand despite the pain. The morning was cold and clear, the sky a perfect dome of pale blue. Everything looked normal, peaceful even, just another day in the wilderness. My boots were gone. I stared at the empty space where I'd left them the previous evening, my mind refusing to accept what I was seeing. They'd been right there, just outside the tent vestibule, exactly where I always put them. Now there was nothing but bare rock. My bear bag hung untouched, swaying gently in a light breeze I couldn't feel down in the ravine. The rope was still taut, the bag at the same height I'd left it. Nothing had tried to get into it during the night. But beneath it, in the dirt, was something new. A perfect circle of ash and rocks, approximately 3 feet in diameter, placed exactly where I'd left my journal bag the night before. The stones that formed the circle were arranged with obsessive precision, each one the same size, equidistant from its neighbors. I knelt slowly, my heart racing again. The ash inside the circle was fine and gray, like the remains of a very old fire. But I hadn't built a fire. I hadn't even used my stove the previous evening, too nervous to do anything that might attract attention. My journal bag lay inside the circle, carefully centered. I reached for it with trembling hands, pulled it toward me, and opened it slowly. The journal was there, closed. I lifted it out, my breath catching sharply in my chest. The page it opened to was blank. I flipped back frantically, looking for the pages I'd filled during the night. Those desperate, fear-soaked words I'd written in the darkness. It's not me. It's not me. I knew I'd written them. I could remember the sensation of pen on paper, the way my hand had cramped from gripping too tightly. But the pages showed nothing. Just pristine, unmarked paper staring back at me. No indentations. No ghost impressions of removed text. The pages looked as if they'd never been touched. I flipped through the entire journal, checking every page. My previous entries were there. Notes about the trail, observations about the landscape, the brief entry from the first night. But nothing from last night. Hours of writing, erased or removed or never existed at all. I sat frozen, breathing shallowly, staring at the empty pages. My mind spun through possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. Had I hallucinated the entire episode? Was the isolation affecting me more severely than I'd realized? But no. The boots were gone. The circle of stones and ash was real. These were physical changes to my environment, not products of imagination. Around me, the canyon walls pressed in silently, offering no explanations or comfort. The morning sun touched the highest peaks, but down here in the ravine, shadows still dominated. I felt exposed despite the enclosing walls, vulnerable in a way that transcended physical danger. Whatever watched me, whatever had spoken with my voice and rearranged my camp and stolen my boots, it wasn't done yet. And I knew deep in my bones that the canyon wouldn't let me leave easily. I'd gone too far in. I'd seen too much. And something out here didn't want witnesses. At first light, I packed what little courage I had left along with my gear. Without boots, I had to improvise. I duct-taped slabs of foam from my sleeping pad to my feet, wrapping them as securely as possible. They provided almost no protection, and I knew they'd fall apart quickly under the strain of hiking. But the physical pain that would come was almost welcome. It kept me grounded, kept me focused on something tangible and immediate rather than the inexplicable terrors of the previous nights. Pain I could understand. Pain made sense. I'd long abandoned the original plan, the article about authentic wilderness experience. My only goal now was simple and urgent. Climb out. Reach the rim. Find other people. Get away from whatever inhabited this canyon. The trail was relentless. Each step sent jolts of pain through my feet as the sharp rocks pressed through the inadequate padding. Within the first 100 yards, I could feel the duct tape beginning to tear. By the first switchback, my feet were bleeding. With each turn of the trail, I felt weaker. The constant uphill climb combined with fear-induced adrenaline exhaustion left me lightheaded and nauseous. My pulse hammered relentlessly behind my eyes, and black spots danced in my peripheral vision whenever I stopped to rest. Every so often, a shadow would flicker at the edge of my vision, forcing my head around. Each time, there was nothing there. The canyon walls remained blank and unforgiving, their ancient stone faces revealing nothing. But the sensation of being watched never diminished. If anything, it intensified. To stay focused, to keep from simply collapsing in despair, I muttered quietly to myself as I climbed. Just keep moving, Jason. One step, then another. Don't stop. Don't think about it. Just move. Then, from somewhere above me on the trail, a voice echoed back clearly. My voice with the exact same inflection and rhythm. One step, then another. I froze mid-step, my body going rigid. Cold sweat prickled across my skin despite the exertion. My stomach twisted violently, threatening to rebel. Who's there? My voice broke as I spoke, sounding thin and afraid. Nothing like the confident ranger I'd once been. The reply was immediate, eerily exact, and chillingly casual. Who's there? It was my voice, but hollow, flat. There was no life in the imitation. No human warmth or emotion. It mocked me, stole my words, and twisted them into something sinister, something wrong. My pulse surged painfully, panic flaring into pure terror. I looked up toward the ridge above me, seeing nothing but rocks and sparse, dry vegetation. The trail switched back several times before reaching that ridge, meaning whatever spoke was at least 100 yards away. "Stop it," I shouted, my voice cracking. "Leave me alone." Silence. Then, after a delay of exactly 3 seconds, "Leave me alone." The same desperate tone, the same crack in the voice. I lost control then. All pretense of dignity or courage evaporated. I sprinted uphill, ignoring the agony in my feet as the duct tape tore completely away. The foam padding shredded on the sharp rocks, exposing raw, bleeding skin. Each step left a crimson smear on the stone. But I didn't care. I just ran. The trail blurred around me. I stumbled and fell, my hands catching my weight on jagged rock that tore open my palms. I scrambled up and ran again, gasping, sobbing, any semblance of rational thought gone. All that remained was pure animal panic, the desperate need to escape. I crested one of the final switchbacks, almost delirious from pain and terror, when something caught my eye just off the trail. A small flash of movement near a twisted juniper tree. Turning sharply, I glimpsed a shape crouched low beside the tree. My vision swam, darkness creeping in from the edges, but I forced my eyes to focus. It rose slowly, emerging into clearer view. My throat closed tightly, breath catching in my chest. It was a person impossibly thin, draped in tattered clothing that might once have been hiking gear but was now just weathered rags. The fabric hung loose on a frame that seemed too skeletal to support life. And on its feet, perfectly clean and maintained despite the filth of everything else, were my boots. The figure stood completely still for a moment, and in that stillness I could see its face, or rather what should have been its face. The features were there, eyes, nose, mouth, but they were wrong. The proportions were slightly off, the placement not quite human, like something that had learned what faces should look like from descriptions, but had never actually seen one. It tilted its head slowly, precisely mirroring the angle of my own head, which I realized had tilted in unconscious horror. I opened my mouth to scream, but nothing came out. My voice had abandoned me completely. The figure took a single step forward, leaning slightly toward me, and I could see its eyes now dark and reflective, and completely empty of anything I recognized as consciousness. No words, no sounds, just an unbearable silence as its head tilted further, studying me with inhuman patience. Instinct took over where conscious thought had failed. I ran blindly, no longer following the trail but simply moving upward, using my hands to climb when the slope became too steep. I crawled on all fours at times, desperate and mindless, operating on nothing but the overwhelming imperative to reach the rim. Gravel cut deeply into my palms and knees. My makeshift shoes had shredded completely, leaving my feet raw and numb. I couldn't feel the individual injuries anymore. It had all merged into one continuous agony that existed somewhere distant from my conscious awareness. Blood mixed with dirt on my hands, making everything slippery. I fell repeatedly, my chin cracking against rock, my shoulders bruising from impact. But each time I fell, I got up and continued climbing. Stopping meant staying, and staying meant I didn't know what it meant, but every cell in my body understood it would be worse than death. The final 100 yards stretched forever. The trail became less distinct here, overgrown in places, completely eroded in others. I followed it more by instinct than sight, my vision tunneling down to just the next handhold, the next place to put my foot. My lungs burned. Each breath felt like inhaling ground glass. My heart hammered so hard I could feel it in my teeth, in my fingertips, in every part of my body. I was aware distantly that I was probably doing permanent damage to myself, that this level of exertion and injury would have long-term consequences. I didn't care. All that mattered was reaching the top, reaching people, reaching safety. When I finally crested the rim, pulling myself over the final rocky ledge onto level ground, I fell to my knees and couldn't get up. My chest heaved, each breath a desperate gasp that never seemed to bring enough oxygen. My vision spun violently, the sky and ground switching places in nauseating arcs. I pressed my forehead against the dirt, trying to anchor myself, trying to convince my body that we'd made it. We were safe. We could stop running now. My hands left bloody prints in the dust. Everything felt distant, underwater, unreal. Slowly, through the ringing in my ears and the pounding of my pulse, a shape came into focus. A vehicle. Green, with an official-looking emblem on the side. A green SUV, the unmistakable insignia of the National Park Service. A ranger stood leaning calmly against it, watching me carefully. He was older, maybe in his 50s, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades in the sun. He took slow steps toward me, his movements steady, cautious, the way you'd approach an injured animal. "Easy now," he said quietly, his voice deliberately calm and measured. "You're all right. You're safe now." I tried to speak, but my throat was painfully dry, lips cracked and bleeding. I swallowed, the action excruciating, and tried again. It wore my voice, I managed to whisper, the words trembling out of me. It had my boots." He hesitated only briefly, and in that hesitation I saw recognition cross his eyes. Not surprise, not disbelief, just grim acknowledgement, as if I'd confirmed something he already knew. Without another word, he opened the vehicle's rear door and gently helped me inside. His hands were strong but careful, supporting my weight as my legs threatened to buckle. The seat felt impossibly soft, impossibly safe. I sank onto it, my entire body shaking uncontrollably, adrenaline finally giving way to shock. The ranger moved to the driver's seat, starting the engine. But before pulling away, he looked back at me through the rearview mirror, then turned slightly to look directly at me. His face was serious, tired in a way that suggested he'd seen too much over too many years. He glanced out toward the empty canyon, toward the trail I'd just climbed, toward the vast expanse of stone and sky that suddenly seemed less like a natural wonder and more like something ancient and aware and not entirely empty. Then he turned back to me, his voice quiet and resigned as he spoke the words that somehow made everything worse. "You're not the first." The vehicle pulled away from the trailhead, gravel crunching under the tires. I looked back through the rear window at the canyon rim, at the trail disappearing down into shadow and stone. For just a moment I thought I saw a figure standing at the edge, watching us leave. It raised one hand slowly, perfectly mimicking a wave goodbye. Then we turned a corner, and it was gone. I never wrote that article. The journal I'd carried into the canyon sits in a drawer in my apartment, most of its pages still blank. Sometimes late at night I pull it out and flip through it, looking for those missing entries, those desperate midnight scrawlings that should be there but aren't. The ranger drove me to the nearest hospital, where doctors treated me for severe dehydration, exposure, and what they carefully termed acute stress reaction. They cataloged my injuries with clinical precision, Multiple lacerations on both feet, extensive bruising, mild hypothermia, nothing that wouldn't heal with time. But there are injuries that don't show up on medical charts, violations of understanding that no amount of time can fully repair. The ranger visited me once before I left. He sat beside my hospital bed and told me things I'm still not sure I believe, even having experienced what I experienced. He said the canyon has always had quiet places, areas where the normal rules seem to bend. He said rangers have learned which trails to avoid, recommending to solo hikers, which campsites to steer people away from. He said I was lucky. Some people who encounter what I encountered don't make it out. When I asked him what it was, what I'd seen and heard, he shook his head. We don't know, he said. We just know it's there. Has been for as long as anyone can remember. Probably longer. Before he left, he looked at me seriously and said, "Don't go back. Whatever you think you need to prove, whatever you think you need to understand, it's not worth it. The canyon keeps what it wants to keep. You got out. Consider that a gift." I never did retrieve my boots. According to the official report, they were lost during the descent, which is technically true even if it misses the essential horror of what actually happened. Sometimes I wonder if they're still down there, still on those feet that weren't quite feet, part of something that mimics and watches and waits. I don't write about wilderness solitude anymore. These days I write about other things: city life, human connection, the importance of community. I live in Phoenix now, where the lights never go out and you're never truly alone. At night I keep my windows closed even in summer, because sometimes carried on the wind from the north where the canyon sits vast and empty, I think I hear a voice, my voice, calling softly, patiently, as if waiting for me to answer, as if waiting for me to return. I never will. God help me, I never will. The first thing I remember about that morning was the silence. 12 years working in Yellowstone National Park teaches you that nature is never truly quiet. There's always something. Birds calling, insects buzzing, the wind through the pines. But that morning, as dawn broke over the eastern ridge, the forest held its breath. My name is Michael Tanner. After 20 years in the Marines, I traded one uniform for another, becoming a park ranger in one of America's most famous wilderness areas. People think rangers just give directions and scold tourists for feeding wildlife. The reality is much more complex. We're search and rescue, law enforcement, environmental scientists, and sometimes the only thing standing between people and nature's indifference. "Mike, you copy?" The radio at my hip crackled, breaking the unnatural silence. "Go ahead, dispatch," I responded, my eyes still scanning the tree line. "Got some campers at Slaw Creek reporting strange noises last night. Probably just wolves, but Site 7 wants someone to check it out when you get a chance." "Roger that. I'm about 20 minutes out. I'll swing by." I'd heard plenty of strange noise reports over the years. Usually it was just wildlife, elk beagling, wolves howling, even bears rummaging through campsites. People from cities aren't used to how loud nature can be, especially at night. But something about this morning felt different. The hairs on my neck stood up, a sensation I hadn't felt since my last deployment. Veterans call it the sixth sense, that primal instinct that warns of danger before your conscious mind can process it. The Slaw Creek campground was one of the more remote overnight areas, popular with serious hikers and wildlife photographers. As I pulled up in my Park Service truck, I spotted a small group gathered near one of the sites, two couples in their 30s, looking sleep-deprived and anxious. "Morning, folks," I called, adjusting my hat as I approached. "Heard you had a rough night?" A tall man with a well-trimmed beard stepped forward. "Ranger, I've been camping my whole life. What we heard last night." He shook his head. "It wasn't natural." His wife nodded. "It started around 2 a.m. Not like a wolf or coyote, more like screaming, but not human either. We thought maybe it was a mountain lion," the other woman offered. I'd heard mountain lions before. Their screams can sound unnervingly human, like a woman in distress. But judging by their expressions, these people had heard something else entirely. "Show me where it was coming from," I said. They pointed toward a dense section of forest about a quarter mile from their campsite. "It moved around," the bearded man added. "Started there, then circled the camp. We shined our flashlights but never saw anything. I took notes and assured them I'd investigate. After they returned to packing up their gear, all of them eager to leave, I headed toward the area they'd indicated. The forest floor was damp from overnight dew, perfect for tracking. I'd spent years learning to read the wilderness like a book, and today the pages were telling an unusual story. About 50 yards in, I found the first footprint. It stopped me cold. The print was large, much larger than a human foot, and deeper than it should be, suggesting considerable weight. But it wasn't a bear track. The shape was all wrong. 5 toes but elongated, almost human-like, but definitely not human. I took photographs and made measurements, feeling that prickle on my neck intensify. The track pattern continued for about 20 yards, then simply vanished, as if whatever made them had either stepped onto rocky ground or disappeared. As I crouched examining the last visible print, a twig snapped somewhere behind me. I turned quickly, hand instinctively moving to my sidearm. Nothing was there, but the silence had returned, that complete unnatural absence of sound that had greeted me at dawn. Even the birds had stopped their morning calls. "Hello," I called out, immediately regretting it. Whatever was out there, announcing my position seemed unwise. For 3 long minutes, I stood perfectly still, scanning the forest. Then from much further away than I expected came a sound that still haunts my dreams. A low guttural vocalization, part growl, part speech, that raised every hair on my body. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a wolf. It wasn't anything I'd heard in 12 years of wilderness work. My radio crackled again, making me flinch. "Mike, you still at Slaw Creek?" It was Sarah, my supervisor. "Affirmative," I managed, my mouth suddenly dry. "When you're done there, we've got something strange at the North Ridge monitoring station. Equipment's been damaged. Looks deliberate." I glanced once more at the footprint, then back to the thick forest where the sound had originated. "I'll head there now," I replied, already backing toward my vehicle, never turning my back to the trees. "And Sarah, tell Bill to bring the wildlife cameras. We might have something unusual in this sector." As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had made those prints, whatever had made that sound, had been watching me the entire time, studying me with the same intensity I'd been studying its tracks. This was only the beginning. I didn't know it then, but that morning would mark the start of the strangest and most terrifying period of my life, far beyond anything I'd encountered in combat or in my previous years as a ranger. Something was moving through Yellowstone, something the scientific textbooks couldn't explain, something the local indigenous tribes had warned about for generations, and somehow I'd been chosen to find it. The monitoring station at North Ridge looked like it had been hit by a small tornado. Solar panels were ripped from their mounts, weather instruments scattered across 20 yards of ground, and the small equipment shed had been forcefully opened, its metal door bent outward as if something had broken out rather than in. "What do you make of it?" Sarah asked, her clipboard already filled with notes. At 52, she had the weathered face of someone who'd spent a lifetime outdoors, and the sharp eyes of a scientist who missed nothing. "Not bears," I said immediately. Too deliberate. Bears would have torn into the food storage, but that's untouched. Bill, our wildlife biologist, was examining the door. "Whatever did this was strong," he muttered. "Very strong." I shared my findings from Slaw Creek. The footprints, the strange vocalization, the unnatural silence. Bill listened with the skeptical expression I expected from him. In the 5 years we'd worked together, he'd become both a close friend and my most rational counterbalance. "Probably a large male grizzly," he suggested. "The footprints could be distorted from the damp ground, and bears can make all sorts of vocalizations people aren't familiar with." "And the equipment?" I asked, gesturing to the destruction around us. He shrugged. "Bears are curious and powerful. They've been known to investigate human structures." It was a reasonable explanation. Part of me wanted to accept it, to file a report about unusual bear activity and move on. The problem was, it didn't feel right. After years in the wild, I'd developed intuition about these things, and everything about this situation felt off. "I want to set up camera traps," I said finally, "around both locations." Sarah nodded, but Bill looked reluctant. "Resources are stretched thin as it is, Mike. The superintendent isn't going to approve wildlife cameras for what's probably just a bear." Then I'll use my own, I replied. I've got 4 trail cams in my cabin. High definition, motion activated. Sarah and Bill exchanged glances. They knew my history. How after my wife died 5 years ago, I'd thrown myself into work, spending off hours photographing wildlife. The cameras had been an expensive investment, my way of staying connected to the park even when off duty. All right, Sarah conceded. But keep this quiet for now. The last thing we need is rumors spreading to visitors about some mystery creature. That evening, I set up 2 cameras near Slaw Creek and 2 near the monitoring station. As darkness fell, I found myself lingering, scanning the forest edge with my flashlight. The feeling of being watched had returned, stronger than before. On my drive back to the ranger housing area, my radio picked up chatter about hikers reporting strange structures in the woods near Lewis Lake, arrangements of branches and stones in patterns too deliberate to be natural. It was outside my sector, but I made a mental note to look into it later. Back at my cabin, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the morning's events, analyzing details, questioning my own perceptions. Around 2 a.m., I pulled out the old journals from my bedside drawer. They belonged to Frank Blackhorn, a Shoshone ranger who'd worked Yellowstone for 30 years before retiring. He'd given them to me my first year, saying simply, "There's more in these woods than science has names for." I dismissed it as the romantic talk of an old man who'd spent too much time alone in the wilderness. But now, I thumbed through the yellowed pages with new interest, stopping at entries about strange encounters, unexplained tracks, and eerie silences in the forest. One passage caught my eye. May 17th, 1987. Found more footprints by the thermal pools. Large over 16 inches. The Shoshone elders call it Soapitse, the tall man who walks between worlds. Scientists would laugh, but science doesn't walk these woods at night. The thing watches, it learns, it's becoming curious about us. The next morning, I woke to pounding on my door. It was Bill, looking like he hadn't slept. "You need to see this," he said, holding up a tablet. The footage was from one of my trail cameras. Time-stamped 3:14 a.m. It showed the forest near Slaw Creek, illuminated by infrared. For the first 10 seconds, nothing. Then a movement subtle at first, a shifting of branches too controlled to be wind. Something large moved at the edge of the frame. "There," Bill pointed, his finger tracing a shape I could barely make out. Tall, bipedal, but strangely proportioned. "Could be a bear standing up," I suggested, playing devil's advocate even as my pulse quickened. "Keep watching." The figure moved again, deliberately angling away from the camera as if aware of its presence. But for one brief moment, it turned, and the camera captured a partial profile. A silhouette that was decidedly not a bear. Too tall, too thin in places, too broad in others. "I've sent this to a colleague at Montana State," Bill said quietly. "Someone I trust. He specializes in wildlife identification using partial imaging." I nodded, surprised by Bill's sudden shift from skeptic to investigator. "What changed your mind?" He hesitated. This wasn't all I found. The camera at the monitoring station caught something too, but not an image. He tapped the screen, switching to an audio file. The cameras record sound when triggered. Listen. What played next was similar to what I'd heard in the forest. That same guttural, almost speech-like vocalization, but longer, more complex. Like something trying to form words with an anatomy not designed for human language. "That's not a bear," Bill said unnecessarily. "It's not any North American wildlife I've ever heard. So what do we do now? We keep this between us and Sarah for the moment. And," he hesitated, "there's someone else I think we should talk to. A professor from the university is visiting next week. Ethnobiologist named Melissa Runningbird. She's been collecting indigenous accounts of unexplained phenomena in American wilderness areas. You think she'll know what this is?" "I think she'll have context we don't," Bill replied. Scientific training combined with traditional knowledge. After Bill left, I sat looking at the frozen image on my tablet, that dark silhouette at the edge of the frame. Whatever it was, it moved with purpose, with intelligence. And somehow, I knew our paths would cross again. I just didn't expect it would happen so soon, or that when it did, one of us wouldn't survive the encounter. Professor Melissa Runningbird wasn't what I expected. In her early 40s with short practical hair and hiking boots worn from actual use, she looked more like a fellow ranger than an academic. We met at the park's research center, a modern building that stood in stark contrast to the wilderness surrounding it. "You must be Ranger Tanner," she said, extending her hand. Her grip was firm, confident. "Bill's told me you've had some unusual experiences recently." I glanced at Bill, who nodded encouragingly. Over the past week, we'd collected more evidence. Additional footprints, strange markings on trees at heights no human could reach, and another audio recording, this one clearer than the first. I'd also been combing through Frank Blackhorn's journals, finding patterns that matched our current situation. "Let me show you what we've found," I said, spreading materials across the conference table. For nearly an hour, Melissa listened intently, examining photos, listening to recordings, and taking meticulous notes. She asked precise, knowledgeable questions that revealed her scientific background, but unlike many academics I'd met, she never once suggested we were overreacting or misinterpreting natural phenomena. "What you're describing," she said finally, "has remarkable similarities to accounts I've collected from multiple tribal traditions across the northern Rockies. The Blackfoot call it Sinktasquets. The Shoshone, as your former colleague noted, know it as Tulai-Pitsa. The most common English term would be Sasquatch or Bigfoot, but those labels carry too much cultural baggage to be useful in serious research." "So you believe it's real?" Sarah asked. She joined us halfway through, initially skeptical but increasingly engaged as the evidence mounted. "I believe people across cultures and throughout history have encountered something they couldn't explain within their existing knowledge frameworks," Melissa replied carefully. "The consistency of these accounts across time and geography suggests an underlying reality, whether biological, psychological, or perceptual." "That's a very academic way of not answering the question," I observed. Melissa smiled slightly. "Fair enough. Yes, I believe something biological exists that accounts for at least some of these encounters. Not a monster, not a myth, but a rare intelligent species that has evolved to avoid human contact and has become exceptionally good at it." She reached into her bag and pulled out a worn leather journal. "This was compiled by my grandfather, who worked with the Civilian Conservation Corps in this region during the 19th. She opened to a marked page and read aloud. "The men refused to return to the North Ridge construction site. 3 separate work crews report being watched from the tree line by something tall and dark. Tools disappear overnight and are found arranged in patterns the next day. The indigenous workers say this is sacred land, a boundary place where the spirit world touches ours. The project supervisor is requesting a location change." "North Ridge," Sarah murmured. "Same area as our damaged monitoring station." Melissa nodded. "There are certain locations that appear repeatedly in these accounts. Places where the boundary between worlds is thinner, as some traditions would describe it." "What exactly are we dealing with here?" I asked. "You're suggesting this is an undiscovered primate species?" "I'm suggesting it might be something that doesn't fit neatly into our taxonomic systems," she replied. "Indigenous knowledge systems don't separate the material from the spiritual the way Western science does. The entity you're encountering might exist in that boundary space, physically real but with attributes our scientific framework struggles to categorize." The conversation was interrupted by my radio. "Mike, you there?" It was Jennings, one of the younger rangers. "Go ahead," I responded. "Got a situation at Trout Lake. Hiking group reported finding some kind of structure. Said it gave them the creeps. They're pretty shaken up." I looked at the others. "I should check this out." "I'd like to come," Melissa said immediately. Bill nodded. "Me too." 20 minutes later, we arrived at Trout Lake. The hiking group, 4 college students on spring break, led us to what they'd found about a quarter-mile off the main trail. As we approached, I felt that familiar sensation, the unnatural silence, the prickling awareness of being observed. The structure stood about 8 feet tall, an intricate arrangement of branches, stones, and what appeared to be animal bones, forming a rough arch shape. It was too deliberate to be random, too complex to be created by natural forces. "This wasn't here 3 days ago," I said, certain because I'd patrolled this area recently. Melissa circled the structure, careful not to touch it. "These arrangements appear in accounts across cultures," she explained. Some traditions describe them as territorial markers, others as ceremonial constructs or communication attempts. Communication? Sarah asked. You think it's trying to send a message? Perhaps. Or it could be responding to our presence. The increased human activity in this area might be perceived as an encroachment. As Melissa spoke, Bill was examining the ground nearby. Mike, he called softly. Tracks. Fresh ones. The footprints were clearer than any we'd found before. Large humanoid, but with anatomical differences that no human foot could produce. They led directly to the structure, then continued deeper into the forest. We should follow them, I said, already checking my gear. That might not be wise, Melissa cautioned. In many traditions, these entities are described as territorial but not inherently hostile unless provoked. Following too aggressively could be perceived as a threat. I considered her words but made my decision. I need to know what we're dealing with. For the safety of the park visitors, if nothing else. Bill agreed to come with me, while Sarah would take Melissa back to the research center to document our findings so far. Before leaving, Melissa placed her hand on my arm. Approach with respect, she said quietly. If this is what I think it is. It's been here long before us and will remain long after. We're the visitors in its territory, not the other way around. Bill and I tracked the footprints for nearly a mile, deeper into the wilderness than most tourists ever ventured. The forest grew denser, older, the massive pines creating cathedral-like spaces between them. The tracks remained clear until we reached a small stream where they vanished. Lost the trail, Bill muttered, scanning the opposite bank. I was about to suggest we cross the stream to continue searching when we heard it. That same vocalization from the audio recordings, but much closer, much louder. It came from somewhere to our right, hidden among the trees. Hello? I called out, ignoring Bill's warning look. We mean no harm. We just want to understand. Silence followed, heavy and expectant. Then a response. A series of sounds that mimicked the cadence of human speech but were decidedly not human words. The voice was deep, resonant, vibrating in my chest more than my ears. Slowly, deliberately, I removed my hat and held it over my heart, a gesture of respect Melissa had described from one of the tribal accounts. We acknowledge you, I said clearly. This is your home. What happened next occurred so quickly that even now I struggle to sequence the events properly. There was movement among the trees, massive, fluid, faster than something that size should be able to move. A glimpse of dark fur, impossibly broad shoulders, a face that was almost human but not quite. Bill raised his camera instinctively, the flash activating in the dim forest light. The reaction was immediate and terrifying. A roar that made the previous vocalization seem gentle by comparison tore through the forest. Trees shook as something large moved rapidly toward us, no longer hiding its presence. Run, I shouted, grabbing Bill's arm. We sprinted back the way we'd come, the sound of pursuit horrifyingly close behind us. I could hear branches breaking, feel the ground trembling with each impact of its stride. Bill was ahead of me, fear giving him speed I'd never seen from the normally sedentary biologist. We reached the stream, and Bill leaped across without hesitation. I followed, but as I landed on the opposite bank, my foot slipped on the wet stone. Pain shot through my ankle as I fell. Mike, Bill turned back. Go, I shouted, knowing he couldn't help me and would only put himself in danger. Get help. Bill hesitated for just a moment, then continued running, disappearing into the trees. I pulled myself up, testing my weight on the injured ankle. It would support me, but running was impossible. I drew my sidearm, a last resort I hoped not to use. Harming the creature felt wrong on a level I couldn't articulate, but self-preservation won out over philosophical concerns. The forest had gone silent again. I turned slowly, scanning the trees, the weight of my service pistol both reassuring and somehow inadequate against what I'd glimpsed. I meant no disrespect, I called out, voice steady despite my racing heart. The light was not meant to harm you. Movement to my left, a shadow passing between trees. I pivoted, weapon raised. Then it stepped into view, fully revealed for the first time. 8 feet tall at least, covered in dark brown fur that hung long in places. Its body was powerfully built, with proportions similar to a human but massively scaled up. The face was what struck me most. Expressive eyes set deep under a heavy brow, a flat nose, lips pulled back to reveal teeth that could tear flesh with ease. But those eyes, they held intelligence, awareness, emotion. It watched me, making no move to attack despite its obvious rage moments before. I realized my pistol was still raised and slowly lowered it. A peace offering of sorts. The creature made a sound softer now, questioning. It took a step forward, and I fought every instinct screaming at me to run. That's when we heard the voices. Bill returning with others, the sound of multiple people moving through the forest. The creature's head snapped toward the noise, then back to me. For one moment, our eyes met directly. A connection across species that felt significant in ways I couldn't yet understand. Then it turned and moved away, disappearing into the forest with a speed and silence that seemed impossible for its size. By the time Bill returned with Sarah and 2 other rangers, I was alone by the stream, my encounter already feeling dreamlike in its intensity and brevity. It was here, I said simply. I saw it. The look Bill gave me was complex. Concern for my injury, regret for leaving me behind, but most of all, belief. He didn't need to ask what I'd seen. He knew. As they helped me back to the vehicles, I glanced back at the forest, certain of one thing. This was far from over. The boundary between our world and something else had been crossed, and I was standing directly on that threshold. Word travels fast in a place like Yellowstone. Even when you try to keep things quiet, within days rumors were circulating among park staff about strange encounters in the northern section. Management called it unusual bear activity in official communications, but the whispered conversations in the ranger station told a different story. My ankle was sprained but not broken. As I recovered on light duty, I spent time with Melissa, poring over historical accounts and comparing them with our recent experiences. We converted one wall of the research center into what some of the younger staff jokingly called our conspiracy board, maps marked with sighting locations, photos of tracks and structures, timelines of incidents stretching back through park records. "There's a pattern here," Melissa said one evening, stepping back to survey our work. "These encounters intensify in roughly 50-year cycles. The last major cluster was in the early 1970s. "What happens during these active periods?" I asked. "According to the tribal accounts, these are times when the boundaries thin, when these beings can more easily cross between their world and ours." I'd grown more accepting of Melissa's perspective, which blended scientific inquiry with indigenous knowledge in a way that felt increasingly relevant to our situation. Whatever we were dealing with existed in the margins between established categories. Not quite animal, not quite something else. "If they're intelligent as you suggest," I said, "why reveal themselves now? Why to us?" "Perhaps they're responding to changes in their environment," she replied. "Climate shifts, human expansion, increased tourism in previously remote areas. Or maybe," she hesitated. "What?" "Maybe they're preparing us for something. In many traditions, these beings are described as messengers or warners, harbingers of change or impending events." Before I could respond, Sarah burst into the room, her normally composed demeanor visibly shaken. "We have a problem," she announced. "A tourist has gone missing near Trout Lake, last seen yesterday afternoon on the same trail where we found the structure." My heart sank. This was the escalation I'd feared, from observation to interaction to something potentially more serious. "Search and rescue's already mobilizing," Sarah continued. "But given what we know," she glanced at our research wall. "I'm coming," I said immediately, testing my ankle. It was still tender but functional enough. "Are you sure that's wise?" Melissa asked. "After your last encounter." "That's exactly why I need to go," I interrupted. It responded to me differently. There was a connection. By nightfall, I was back at Trout Lake with the search team. The missing tourist, a 28-year-old man named Jason Mercer, had separated from his friends to take photographs and never returned to their meeting point. His backpack had been found on the trail, contents undisturbed except for his camera, which was missing. We organized into search patterns, methodically covering the area with trained efficiency. I requested the sector nearest to where I'd encountered the creature the week before, bringing along one of the park's cadaver dogs and its handler, Rebecca. Management thinks it's a bear attack. Rebecca said quietly as we hiked deeper into the forest. Is that what you think? I glanced at her, measuring my response. Rebecca was experienced, level-headed, and not given to gossip. I think we should keep an open mind about what happened to Mercer. She nodded, seeming to accept this diplomatic non-answer. As darkness fell, we switched to thermal imaging equipment, continuing the search by the eerie green glow of night vision. Around midnight, the radio crackled. Another team had found something. Not Mercer, but a camera hanging from a tree branch about a mile from where his backpack was discovered. They were bringing it back to the command post. An hour later, our team was called in too. The search was suspended until dawn. Standard procedure for safety reasons, though it felt wrong to abandon Mercer to the night. Back at the command post, park officials had downloaded the images from the recovered camera. I joined Sarah, Bill, and the search coordinator as they reviewed them. The first dozen shots were typical tourist photos, landscape vistas, wildlife, selfies on scenic overlooks. Then the images changed character. They became hastier, less composed, as if taken while moving quickly. Several showed blurry glimpses of the forest floor, tree trunks rushing by. He was running, Bill observed unnecessarily. The final images were the most disturbing, partial frames of something large moving between trees. A dark, massive shape at the edge of one frame, and the last photo, a close-up of what appeared to be a face, but distorted by motion blur and poor light. Could be a bear, the search coordinator suggested, but his tone lacked conviction. I said nothing, but exchanged glances with Bill and Sarah. We knew better. The search resumed at first light, with additional personnel brought in from neighboring districts. I rejoined Rebecca and her dog, continuing where we'd left off. My ankle throbbed with each step, but I pushed through the discomfort, driven by a growing sense of urgency. Around mid-morning, Rebecca's dog alerted, pulling hard on its leash toward a dense thicket of undergrowth. My heart sank, expecting the worst. Mercer's body, perhaps mauled or partially consumed. What we found instead was far stranger. A small clearing had been formed in the thicket, the vegetation carefully bent back rather than broken. In the center lay Mercer's camera, intact and deliberately placed on a bed of moss. Beside it was a neat arrangement of objects: Mercer's wallet, keys, watch, and cell phone, all his personal items, undamaged and arranged in what appeared to be a geometric pattern. "What the hell?" Rebecca whispered. I activated my radio.
Command post, this is Tanner. I've found Mercer's belongings, but no sign of Mercer himself.
I described the scene, trying to stick to observable facts without interpretation. As Rebecca documented the site with photographs, I studied the arrangement more closely. The objects formed a pattern that seemed vaguely familiar, similar to the structures we'd found, but in miniature. "It's returning his things," I said, realization dawning. "Like an offering." "What is?" Rebecca asked, eyeing me cautiously. Before I could decide how much to tell her, the dog alert changed character. Not the urgent indication of finding its target, but a low growl of warning. The animal backed up, hackles raised, staring intently into the forest beyond the clearing. I felt it too, that familiar, prickling awareness. We were being watched. "Rebecca," I said quietly, "I need you to take the dog and walk calmly back to the main trail. Call for backup, but tell them not to approach with sirens or lights. Understood?" To her credit, she asked no questions, recognizing the authority in my voice. With a last concerned glance, she retreated with the still growling dog. Once alone, I turned to face the presence I could feel among the trees. "I know you're there," I called out. "I mean no harm. I just want to find the man who's missing." Silence stretched for several long moments. Then from deeper in the forest came the response, that now familiar vocalization, but with new patterns, new inflections. It sounded almost conversational. Slowly I stepped forward, moving away from the arranged belongings and closer to the presence I could sense but not yet see. "Did you take him?" I asked, keeping my voice level. "Is he alive?" Movement among the trees, deliberate this time, not the rushed aggression of our last encounter. The massive shape emerged partially from the shadows, visible enough that I could make out its features but remaining half concealed behind a large pine. It made another series of sounds, then gestured with an enormous hand, a motion that unmistakably meant follow me. Every rational part of my training screamed that this was dangerous, foolhardy. But something deeper, more intuitive, told me this was important, that the creature could have harmed me already if that was its intention. I'll follow, I said clearly. But my friends need to know where I am. I keyed my radio. This is Tanner. I'm pursuing a new lead, heading northeast from the clearing. I'm safe, but don't follow immediately. I'll maintain radio contact. I ignored the immediate questions that crackled in response, clipping the radio to my belt. The creature watched this exchange with obvious interest, then turned and moved deeper into the forest. I followed, maintaining a respectful distance. We traveled for nearly an hour, moving steadily uphill into areas rarely visited even by experienced hikers. The terrain grew increasingly rugged, with rock formations creating natural passages and tiny valleys hidden between ridges. Eventually, we reached what appeared to be a dead end, a rock face rising steeply before us. The creature stopped, turned to ensure I was still following, then moved toward a narrow opening in the rock that I would have overlooked entirely. It ducked inside, and after a moment's hesitation, I followed. The passage widened immediately into a cave system, surprisingly large and illuminated by patches of sunlight filtering through cracks in the ceiling. The air was cool but not damp, with an earthy, musty scent that wasn't unpleasant. And there, propped against the far wall on what appeared to be a bed of gathered vegetation, was Jason Mercer. Alive, apparently unharmed, but in a state of what seemed like tranquil shock, conscious but unresponsive to my presence. The creature moved to stand near him, making a series of gestures that seemed to indicate care or concern. I approached cautiously, checking Mercer's pulse and pupils. Physically, he appeared fine. No injuries, normal vital signs, but his mental state was concerning. Jason? I tried. Jason Mercer? I'm Ranger Tanner. I'm here to help you. His eyes focused on me briefly before drifting away again, his expression peaceful despite the circumstances. I turned to the creature, which was observing our interaction intently. Did you bring him here? Why? In response, the creature moved to another section of the cave and touched the wall. I approached cautiously, and was astonished to see drawings, primitive but recognizable depictions of humans, animals, and larger beings that resembled my host. Some appeared ancient, others more recent, created with charcoal, clay, and natural pigments. The creature pointed to one section showing small figures and larger ones interacting peacefully, then to another showing destruction, what looked like fires, floods, and figures in distress. The message seemed clear enough. Cooperation versus catastrophe. You're trying to communicate something important, I said slowly. About us, about our relationship with your kind. The creature made a sound that seemed affirmative, then pointed to Mercer before touching its own head. Something about minds, or thinking, or perception. Did you do something to him? I asked, struggling to understand. To his mind? Another affirmative sound, followed by gestures that suggested gentleness or healing. My radio crackled, breaking the moment. Tanner, come in. It's been 45 minutes since your last check-in. I keyed the radio. I'm okay. I've found Mercer. He's alive but needs medical attention. We're in a cave system northeast of the original search area. I provided coordinates as best I could estimate. The creature watched this exchange with obvious intelligence, then made a decision. It approached Mercer, gently lifted him as effortlessly as I might lift a child, and carried him toward the cave entrance. The meaning was clear. It was returning him, now that contact had been established. Wait, I said, reaching into my pocket. I pulled out my notebook and quickly sketched a simple map of the park, marking the ranger station, the research center, and our current location. If you want to communicate again, come here. I pointed to the research center. We'll meet you. Just you and me, I added, pointing. As I watched the massive creature carry Jason Mercer toward the cave entrance, I felt suspended between realities. The rational world of park regulations and scientific classification, and something older, something that existed in the spaces our modern minds had learned to ignore. Wait, I called again, following them. Will he be all right? What did you do to him? The creature paused, turning its impressive frame to regard me. Its eyes, deep set under that prominent brow, held an intelligence that still startled me. With deliberate movements, it raised one hand to its temple, then gestured toward the sky, making a flowing motion outward. The meaning wasn't immediately clear, but I had the impression it was trying to convey something about consciousness or perception, as if Mercer's mind had been opened to something beyond normal human awareness. We emerged from the cave into the afternoon light. The creature set Mercer down gently against a tree, arranging him in a position that seemed almost ceremonial. Then it turned to me once more, making that same vocalization that had become familiar, not quite speech, but definitely communication. I don't understand everything, I admitted, but I know you're trying to tell us something important. I'll come back, I promise. The creature studied me for a long moment, then did something unexpected. It raised its hand in what appeared to be a deliberate mimicry of a human wave, goodbye. With that single, strangely moving gesture, it turned and vanished into the forest with that impossible speed and silence. I radioed the search team, guiding them to our location. Within 20 minutes, paramedics had reached us, immediately attending to Mercer, who remained in his strange, tranquil state. As they checked his vitals and prepared him for transport, Sarah arrived, eyes wide with questions she couldn't ask in front of the others. Later, I mouthed, and she nodded, understanding. At the park's medical facility, doctors diagnosed Mercer with what they termed dissociative amnesia, a temporary condition they attributed to trauma and exposure. He remained calm, even peaceful, showing no signs of distress despite his ordeal. The only thing that seemed to animate him was when I visited his room that evening. "You saw it too," he said, his first coherent sentence since being found. "It showed you." "Showed me what, Jason?" I asked carefully, conscious of the hospital staff nearby. His eyes, previously unfocused, locked onto mine with sudden clarity. "Everything is connected. They've always been here, watching from the edges. Guardians of the boundary." He leaned forward. "It didn't hurt me. It healed something, showed me how to see." Before I could ask more, he drifted back into his detached state. The momentary connection lost. The doctors recommended transferring him to a psychiatric facility in Bozeman for further evaluation. That night, we gathered at the research center. Myself, Sarah, Bill, and Melissa. I recounted every detail of the encounter, describing the cave, the drawings, and Mercer's strange condition. "This changes everything," Melissa said quietly when I'd finished. "Direct, peaceful contact, communication attempts, evidence of artistic expression and symbolic thinking. This isn't just an undiscovered primate species. This is something that challenges our entire understanding of consciousness and evolution. And reality itself," I added, remembering the creature's gestures about Mercer's mind. "I think it somehow altered his perception, showed him something our conventional understanding can't accommodate." Bill, ever the scientist, looked troubled. "We need evidence. Documentation. Without it, this is just another Bigfoot story nobody will take seriously." "The cave?" Sarah suggested. "If we could document those drawings." "No," I interrupted firmly. "Not yet. That's its sanctuary, maybe even home. Invading with cameras and equipment would violate the trust that's being established." "Then what do we do?" Bill asked. I considered the question carefully. "We wait. I showed it where to find us if it wants further contact, and I think it will. It's clearly trying to communicate something important." "About what?" Sarah pressed. "I'm not entirely sure," I admitted. "But based on the cave drawings, I think it's warning us about something, showing two possible futures for our relationship with their kind, and maybe with the natural world itself." For the next week, we maintained our regular duties while establishing a discreet observation protocol around the research center. Melissa extended her stay indefinitely. Her university department suddenly very interested in her field research once certain details carefully filtered were shared with her department head. Mercer was transferred to Bozeman, his condition unchanged. I visited before he left, but he remained in that peaceful, detached state, occasionally making cryptic comments about seeing beyond the veil and messengers at the edge of understanding. 10 days after the cave encounter, our vigilance was rewarded. It was just after midnight. I was alone at the research center, reviewing old park records that mentioned similar incidents dating back to the 1930s. A soft sound from outside caught my attention. Not threatening, but deliberate, like someone trying to quietly announce their presence. I moved to the window and felt my heart jump. Standing at the forest edge, partially illuminated by the outdoor security lights, was the creature. It wasn't hiding or lurking. It stood in plain view, waiting to be acknowledged. Grabbing my jacket, I stepped outside into the cool night air. "You came," I said simply. It made that now familiar vocalization, then gestured for me to follow. Instead of heading back toward the deep wilderness, however, it moved parallel to the facility, staying within the tree line but clearly wanting to show me something nearby. We walked for about 5 minutes until reaching a small clearing. There, arranged in the center, was another structure, similar to the ones we'd found before, but more complex, more deliberately crafted. It stood about 7 feet tall, an intricate lattice of branches, stones, and what appeared to be carved pieces of wood. The creature moved to stand beside it, then pointed upward at the night sky. I followed its gesture and gasped. Directly above us, the stars were unusually brilliant, with the Milky Way forming a perfect arc over the clearing. The structure, I realized, aligned precisely with certain stars and constellations. "It's a calendar," I murmured, understanding dawning, or a marker of some kind. The creature made an affirmative sound, then touched the structure at various points, each time looking up at different celestial positions. It was showing me correlations between the stars and the structure, between cosmic events and earthly ones. What followed was one of the most extraordinary hours of my life. Through a combination of gestures, vocalizations, and drawings scratched in the dirt, the creature conveyed a complex message I'm still working to fully understand. From what I could interpret, these beings, whatever name they have for themselves, exist in a kind of parallel relationship with our world. They move between realms or states of being that our minds aren't equipped to perceive. The structures they create serve as markers or anchors for these transitions. Most crucially, they were trying to warn us. Something was changing in the environment, in the cosmic alignment, in the relationship between our worlds. The drawings showed disaster scenarios that seemed both ecological and spiritual in nature. When our improvised communication session ended, the creature did something truly unexpected. It reached out one massive hand and gently touched my shoulder. The gesture was so human, so filled with what could only be described as compassion, that I felt tears spring to my eyes. "We'll try to understand," I promised. "We'll try to help." It nodded, a perfectly human gesture that underscored the strangeness of our interaction, and then melted back into the forest darkness. I returned to the research center and immediately documented everything while it was fresh in my mind. By morning, I had filled a dozen pages with notes, sketches, and attempts to decode the messages I'd received. When I shared my experience with Melissa, Sarah, and Bill, their reactions ranged from excitement to concerned skepticism, especially regarding my interpretation of the warning. "You're suggesting these beings are trying to alert us to some kind of impending ecological catastrophe?" Bill asked, frowning at my notes. "Or a dimensional shift, or a breakdown in whatever separates our reality from theirs," I replied, aware of how it sounded. "I know it seems fantastic, but..." "Actually," Melissa interrupted, "it aligns with prophecies and warnings from multiple indigenous traditions. Many speak of a time when the boundaries between worlds would thin, when spirit beings would become more visible and attempt to communicate with humanity before a great change." Over the following weeks, we documented 4 more encounters, twice with me alone, and twice with Melissa present as well. Each interaction built upon the previous, creating a complex tapestry of communication that blended environmental concerns with concepts that seemed to transcend conventional scientific understanding. The creature, which we now called simply the messenger, avoiding the cultural baggage of terms like Sasquatch or Bigfoot, showed us locations in the park where the boundary between worlds was particularly thin. These places aligned. Jason Mercer eventually returned to the park, not as a tourist, but as someone transformed by his experience. The doctors had been unable to classify his condition beyond general terms like altered state of consciousness, but he appeared functional. "You've continued the contact," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I admitted. "We're trying to understand the message." He smiled serenely. "The message isn't just information. It's a shift in perspective. They don't just exist in our world. They show us that our world is bigger than we thought. The boundaries we perceive are constructs of limited consciousness." His words echoed what the messenger had been trying to convey through its more limited means of communication. In my final documented encounter, 3 months after that first morning of unnatural silence at Slaw Creek, the messenger brought others of its kind, 3 additional beings of varying sizes, though all shared the same basic features. They approached our small research team, now expanded to include 2 trusted colleagues with specialized knowledge, with what could only be described as ceremonial intent. What followed was an exchange of knowledge unlike anything in recorded scientific history. Through a combination of vocalization, gesture, and symbols drawn in the earth, they conveyed a complex cosmology, a vision of reality as layered dimensions that periodically align and separate in cycles, tied to both celestial movements and human activity. The warning became clearer. Human actions, particularly our damage to the environment, were accelerating a natural cycle of realignment between worlds. Without a shift in our relationship to the natural world, this premature merging would be catastrophic for both our kind and theirs. As our understanding grew, so did the evidence of their existence throughout the park. More structures appeared, arranged in patterns that corresponded to star alignments and environmental features. Trail cameras captured partial images that, while still ambiguous enough to be dismissed by skeptics, formed a compelling pattern when viewed collectively. Management eventually had to acknowledge the situation, though the official position remained cautious. A small, specialized research unit was established, ostensibly to study unusual wildlife behavior patterns, but actually dedicated to documenting and interpreting these encounters. For me, the experience has fundamentally altered how I understand my role as a ranger and my place in the natural world. Where once I saw boundaries between wilderness and civilization, between science and spirituality, between human and non-human intelligence, I now see continuums, relationships, interconnected systems that don't yield to our human categories. I still patrol the same forests, still help lost hikers and warn tourists about approaching wildlife too closely. But I do so with a profound awareness that I'm walking in a world far more complex and mysterious than most people realize. The messengers remain largely hidden, revealing themselves only to those who approach with respect and openness. Jason Mercer never returned to his previous life. Instead, he joined a small community of people who had similar encounters across various wilderness areas. People forever changed by glimpsing what exists at the edges of human perception. As for the messengers themselves, they continue their silent guardianship of the boundary places. Sometimes, in the early morning hours when the forest falls into that unnatural silence, I know they're near. Watching, waiting, hoping we'll finally learn to see the world as they do, not as something to be conquered or classified, but as a living system of which we are just one small interconnected part. The warning remains, carried in the structures they build and the symbols they share. The boundaries between worlds are thinning. How we respond in the coming years will determine not just our fate, but the fate of beings we're only beginning to understand. Beings that have watched us from the shadows since before our histories began. Sometimes, standing at the forest edge as darkness falls, I imagine future generations of rangers, scientists and indigenous knowledge keepers working together to maintain this delicate relationship between worlds. It's a vision worth working toward, a new kind of stewardship that recognizes mysteries beyond our current understanding. Until then, I maintain my daily patrols, document each new encounter, and listen for that distinctive silence that tells me I'm not alone in these ancient woods. The messengers are there, just beyond the veil of our ordinary perception, waiting for more of us to learn how to truly see. My name is Michael Martinez, and I am 71 years old now. But this story takes place in 2007 when I was 54. I've been hesitant to share this account for years, but as time passes, I feel an increasing need to put these events down on paper. What happened during that covert mission in the dense forests of Maine has haunted me for nearly 2 decades, and perhaps by sharing it I can finally find some peace. It was late September 2007 when I received the call. I had been enjoying a rare moment of downtime at my home in Virginia Beach, tending to my small vegetable garden and relishing the crisp autumn air. The caller ID showed a number I recognized all too well. It was Captain Marcus Thorne, my commanding officer and longtime friend. "Martinez," I answered, already sensing that my peaceful afternoon was about to be cut short. "Mike, we've got a situation." Marcus's gravelly voice came through, tight with tension. I need you in Maine ASAP. Briefing in 12 hours. I didn't ask questions. In our line of work, you learn quickly that information is given on a need-to-know basis. I simply acknowledged the order and began packing. The next morning, I found myself in a nondescript conference room at Naval Air Station Brunswick. The room was sparse, with just a large table, some chairs, and a projector screen on one wall. As I entered, I nodded to the familiar faces already present. Liam Creighton, our tech expert, was hunched over a laptop, his fingers flying across the keyboard. At 32, Liam was the youngest of our group, but his skills with anything electronic were unparalleled. His boyish features belied the sharp intellect behind his green eyes. Next to him sat Danny Blanchard, built like a tank and just as formidable. At 40, Danny was our muscle, capable of bench pressing small cars and possessing an aim that could thread a needle at 500 yards. His dark skin glistened with a thin sheen of sweat. He'd probably been working out to burn off pre-mission jitters. Captain Marcus Thorne stood at the head of the table, his salt and pepper hair cropped close to his scalp, steel gray eyes scanning a file in front of him. At 58, Marcus was technically past the age for field operations, but his experience and leadership were invaluable. Plus, I knew there wasn't a force on Earth that could keep Marcus behind a desk when his team was in the field. As I took my seat, Marcus began the briefing without preamble. Gentlemen, we have a high-value target on our hands, he said, his voice low and serious. Viktor Volkov, Russian arms dealer, has gone off the grid. Intel suggests he's holed up in an old Cold War-era bunker deep in the Maine woods. Liam pulled up a satellite image on the projector screen, showing a dense forest area with no visible structures. The bunker is well hidden, Marcus continued. It was part of a secret network of fallout shelters built in the 50s and largely forgotten. We believe Volkov is using it as a temporary base of operations before moving a large shipment of weapons. Any idea on the bunker's defenses? I asked, studying the image. Marcus shook his head. Limited information. We know it has multiple levels, but the exact layout is unclear. Expect outdated but possibly functional security systems. Liam, that's where you come in. Liam nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. He loved a good tech challenge. Our mission is simple, Marcus said, his eyes meeting each of ours in turn. Infiltrate the bunker, capture Volkov if possible, neutralize if necessary, and secure any intel on his operation and the weapons shipment. Danny cracked his knuckles, a habit that always made me wince. When do we move out, Cap? Will 600 tomorrow? We'll chopper into a clearing about 10 clicks from the target. From there, we go silent and on foot. Marcus paused, his expression grave. I don't need to tell you how critical this mission is. Volkov's operation has been linked to multiple terrorist attacks across Europe. Taking him down could save countless lives. We spent the next few hours going over every detail we had, which wasn't much. The bunker's location was our biggest advantage. Volkov likely thought he was safe in such a remote area, but that isolation was a double-edged sword. We would be on our own, with no immediate backup if things went south. As the briefing concluded, I caught Marcus's eye. He gave me a subtle nod, and I knew he wanted to talk privately. Once the others had filed out, I approached him. What's on your mind, Marcus? I asked, noting the deep lines of worry etched into his face. He sighed, rubbing a hand over his stubbled chin. Something about this doesn't feel right, Mike. The intel is too neat, too convenient. It's like we're being handed Volkov on a silver platter. I nodded, having had similar thoughts. You think it's a trap? I don't know, Marcus admitted. But keep your eyes open out there. If anything feels off, anything at all, I want to know immediately. You got it, boss, I assured him, clapping him on the shoulder. We've been through worse, right? Marcus attempted a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. Let's hope so, old friend. Let's hope so. The next morning dawned cold and misty. We boarded a Black Hawk helicopter in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. As we lifted off, I watched the coastline of Maine recede, giving way to an endless expanse of forest. The vibrant reds and golds of the autumn leaves created a stark contrast to the gravity of our mission. We touched down in a small clearing, the downdraft from the rotors sending leaves swirling around us as we disembarked. The pilot gave us a thumbs up before lifting off again, leaving us alone in the wilderness. Comms check, Marcus ordered as we gathered our gear. We each tested our earpieces, confirming clear communication. Liam pulled out a tablet, bringing up a topographical map of the area. The bunker should be about 6 miles northeast of our position, he said, zooming in on the map. Terrain looks rough, lots of elevation changes. Marcus nodded. We move in a diamond formation. I'll take point, Liam center, Danny rear guard. Mike, you've got our left flank. Keep your eyes peeled and stay frosty. Move out. We fell into formation, moving through the forest with practiced ease. Despite the weight of our packs and weapons, we made good time, our boots crunching softly on the carpet of fallen leaves. The forest was alive with the sounds of wildlife. Birds calling, small animals scurrying through the underbrush. But as we drew closer to our target, I noticed a gradual change. The natural sounds began to fade, replaced by an eerie silence that set my teeth on edge. We paused at the top of a small ridge, taking a moment to catch our breath and survey the area. The trees seemed to press in around us, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. A sense of unease settled over me, and I wasn't the only one feeling it. You guys feel that? Danny whispered, his eyes darting from tree to tree. Marcus held up a hand for silence, cocking his head to listen. For a long moment, we heard nothing but the soft whisper of the wind through the leaves. Then faintly, a sound reached us, a low pulsing hum, barely audible but definitely there. What the hell is that? Liam muttered, frowning as he looked at his tablet. I'm not picking up any electronic signatures that could be causing it. Could be machinery in the bunker, I suggested, though I didn't quite believe it myself. The sound seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Marcus's jaw tightened. We press on, but stay alert. Something's not right here. We continued our trek, the strange humming growing slightly louder as we progressed. The forest around us seemed to change subtly. The trees grew more gnarled and twisted, their bark taking on an almost sickly pallor. The ground beneath our feet became soggy, each step accompanied by a wet squelch. After what felt like hours but was likely only 45 minutes, Liam held up a hand, gesturing for us to stop. We should be right on top of it, he whispered, looking up from his tablet with a confused expression. But I don't see anything. We spread out, searching the area carefully. The bunker entrance was supposed to be here, but all I could see were trees, rocks, and more trees. The humming was louder now, a constant presence that seemed to vibrate in my bones. It was Danny who found it. Over here, he called softly, waving us over to a large moss-covered boulder. As we gathered around, I saw what had caught his attention. There, partially hidden by the moss, was a seam in the rock, too straight and even to be natural. Marcus nodded approvingly. Good eye, Danny. Liam, see if you can get us in. Liam set to work, carefully removing the moss to reveal a hidden control panel. His fingers flew over the ancient keypad, his brow furrowed in concentration. After a few tense minutes, there was a soft beep, and the rock face began to slide open with a grating sound of stone on stone. We raised our weapons, half expecting to be met with gunfire, but as the entrance fully opened, we were greeted only by darkness and a rush of stale, musty air. Marcus clicked on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom to reveal a narrow metal staircase descending into the earth. The humming was louder here, emanating from somewhere deep below. Remember the mission, Marcus said quietly, his voice tight. We find Volkov, we get the intel, we get out. Stay together and stay sharp. With a deep breath, we entered the bunker, the stone door sliding shut behind us with a finality that sent a shiver down my spine. Little did we know that we were descending into a nightmare far beyond anything we could have imagined. The air in the bunker was thick and oppressive, heavy with the scent of rust and decay. Our flashlights cut through the darkness, illuminating a narrow corridor that stretched ahead of us. The walls were lined with pipes and conduits, many of which were corroded or broken, leaking unknown fluids that pooled on the concrete floor. We moved cautiously, our footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. The humming we had heard outside was louder here, a constant vibration that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. It set my teeth on edge, and I could see the tension in my teammates' faces as well. Liam, any read on the layout? Marcus whispered as we reached a junction where the corridor split in 3 directions. Liam shook his head, frustration evident in his voice.
Nothing, sir. Something's interfering with the signal. I can't get a clear map.
Marcus cursed under his breath. All right, we'll have to do this the old-fashioned way. Danny, you and Liam take the left corridor. Mike and I will go right. We'll circle back and meet at this junction in 30 minutes. If you find anything, radio immediately. Clear. We nodded, and with a final glance at each other, we split up. As Marcus and I made our way down the right corridor, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The darkness seemed to press in around us, our flashlights creating more shadows than they dispelled. You feel it too, don't you? Marcus murmured, his eyes constantly scanning our surroundings. I nodded grimly. Something's not right here, Marcus. Where's Volkov's security? Hell, where's Volkov? Before Marcus could respond, a sharp cry echoed through the corridor, followed by the sound of gunfire. We froze, recognizing Danny's voice. Danny! Liam, report! Marcus barked into his radio. For a moment, there was only static. Then Liam's voice came through, breathless and panicked. Captain, we need backup! There's something. Oh God, what is that thing? More gunfire, then a scream that made my blood run cold. The radio went dead. Without a word, Marcus and I turned and sprinted back towards the junction. As we rounded the corner into the left corridor, we nearly collided with Liam. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. Where's Danny? I demanded, grabbing Liam's shoulders to steady him. Liam shook his head, his voice barely above a whisper.
It took him.
I've never seen anything like it. We were checking one of the rooms and it just appeared. Danny pushed me out and told me to run, but I saw it grab him and... A low inhuman growl echoed down the corridor, cutting off Liam's words. We all turned, weapons raised, as a figure emerged from the darkness. At first glance, it might have been human, but as it stepped into the light, I felt my heart skip a beat. The thing was tall, impossibly so, its limbs too long and jointed in all the wrong places. Its skin was a sickly gray, stretched tight over a gaunt frame, but it was the face that truly horrified me. A featureless expanse of flesh, with only a gaping tooth-lined maw where a mouth should be. For a moment we stood frozen in shock. Then the creature lunged, moving with a speed that belied its awkward appearance. Marcus was the first to react, opening fire. The creature staggered as the bullets hit, but didn't go down. Fall back, Marcus yelled, continuing to fire as Liam and I retreated down the corridor. We ran, the sound of the creature's otherworldly shrieks spurring us on. I had no idea where we were going. The corridors all looked the same in our panic. Finally, we burst through a set of heavy metal doors into what appeared to be some kind of control room. Liam slammed the doors shut behind us, his hands shaking as he tried to engage the locking mechanism. What the hell was that thing? He gasped, his voice verging on hysteria. I don't know, Marcus said grimly, but it's clear we're dealing with something far beyond our original mission parameters. I moved deeper into the room, my flashlight revealing banks of ancient computers and monitoring equipment. Most of it looked dead, but a few screens flickered with static. Cap, over here, I called, gesturing to a logbook I'd found on one of the desks. The pages were yellowed with age, but the most recent entry was dated just a week ago. Marcus joined me, flipping through the book with a growing look of horror on his face. This isn't a weapons cache, he muttered. It's some kind of research facility. These logs mention experiments, test subjects. My God, what have we stumbled into? A loud bang on the doors made us all jump. The creature had found us. We need to find another way out, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Liam, see if you can get any of these systems online. There might be a map or some kind of security feed we can use. Liam nodded, moving to one of the computer banks with shaking hands. As he worked, I could hear the creature outside, its inhuman cries mixing with the sound of rending metal. Got something, Liam exclaimed after what felt like an eternity. One of the larger screens flickered to life, showing a schematic of the bunker. There's an emergency exit 2 levels down. It leads to a tunnel system that comes out about a mile from here. Another crash from the doors. They wouldn't hold much longer. All right, here's the plan, Marcus said, his voice calm despite the dire situation. We make for that exit. Stick together. Watch each other's backs. If we get separated, head for the surface and don't look back. Understood? Liam and I nodded. There was no need for further words. We'd been through hell together before, but this was something else entirely. As the doors finally gave way with a screech of tortured metal, we were already moving. Marcus took point, his rifle at the ready, while I covered our rear. Liam, still clutching his tablet, guided us through the maze-like corridors of the bunker. The creature's howls echoed behind us, joined by other equally horrifying sounds. It wasn't alone. Left here, Liam shouted, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of inhuman shrieks and our pounding footsteps. We rounded the corner and found ourselves facing a steep stairwell. Without hesitation, we plunged down, taking the steps two at a time. The air grew colder, damper, as we descended deeper into the earth. Halfway down, I risked a glance back. What I saw made my blood run cold. Multiple shapes were moving in the darkness above us, their elongated limbs scrabbling at the walls as they pursued us. "Keep moving," I yelled, firing a burst from my rifle to slow them down. We reached the bottom of the stairs and sprinted down another corridor. The emergency exit, according to Liam's map, was just ahead. Suddenly, Marcus skidded to a halt, throwing out an arm to stop us. "Look," he said, pointing ahead with his flashlight. The beam illuminated a figure slumped against the wall. As we approached cautiously, I felt my heart sink. It was Danny. His chest was a mess of blood and torn flesh. But somehow, impossibly, he was still breathing. His eyes fluttered open as we reached him. "Cap. Mike," he gasped, his voice barely audible. You need to destroy this place. What they were doing here, it can't get out." Marcus knelt beside him, his face a mask of grief and determination. "We'll get you out of here, soldier. Just hold on." Danny shook his head weakly. "No time. I'm done for. But listen, the exit, it's rigged. Fail-safe. Whole place will collapse. You have to..." His words trailed off as his eyes closed. Danny Blanchard, our friend and brother-in-arms, was gone. For a moment we stood in silence, the weight of loss heavy on our shoulders. Then the sounds of pursuit snapped us back to reality. "We have to move," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "We owe it to Danny to finish this." Marcus nodded grimly. "Liam, how far to the exit?" "Just around the next bend," Liam replied, his eyes red-rimmed but focused. We moved on, leaving Danny's body behind. Each step felt like a betrayal, but we had no choice. The emergency exit was a heavy blast door, clearly designed to withstand significant force. Next to it was a complex-looking control panel. "This is it," Liam said, already working on the panel. "Give me a minute to bypass the security." "Make it fast," Marcus growled, taking up a defensive position. I joined him, both of us facing back the way we had come. The creatures were getting closer. I could hear them moving in the darkness, their unnatural movement sending chills down my spine. "Got it," Liam exclaimed. The blast door began to slide open with a hiss of hydraulics. Just then, the first of the creatures rounded the corner. It was the same type we had encountered earlier, all twisted limbs and gaping maw. Behind it I could see more shapes moving in the shadows. "Go," Marcus shouted, opening fire. I joined him, our bullets tearing into the creature's flesh. It staggered but kept coming. Liam had already slipped through the door. "Come on," he yelled. I backed up, still firing. "Marcus, let's go." But Marcus stood his ground. "Get out of here, Mike. I'll hold them off and trigger the failsafe." "Like hell you will," I growled, grabbing his arm. "We go together or not at all." For a second, I thought he would argue. Then he nodded, a grim smile on his face. "Together, then. On 3. 1. We turned and ran, diving through the blast door just as the creatures reached us. Liam was already at another control panel on this side. "Close it," Marcus yelled. Liam's fingers flew over the controls. The door began to slide shut, agonizingly slowly. I could see the creatures on the other side, their inhuman faces contorted in what might have been rage. Just as the nearest one reached the gap, the door slammed shut with a resounding clang. We heard muffled shrieks and the sound of claws scraping against metal, but the door held. "The failsafe," Marcus panted. How do we trigger it? Liam pointed to a large red lever on the wall. I think that's it. But sir, if we pull that... I know, Marcus said. The whole place comes down, with us inside. We shared a look, all of us understanding the gravity of the situation. We had found something here that was never meant to see the light of day. Something that could potentially devastate the world if it got out. We had a duty to make sure that didn't happen, even if it cost us our lives. It's been an honor serving with you both, Marcus said softly. I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. Liam merely straightened his back, a look of determination replacing the fear in his eyes. Together we grasped the lever. With one last shared glance, we pulled it down. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the world exploded around us. The tunnel we were in began to shake violently. Dust and small rocks rained down from the ceiling. In the distance, we could hear the sound of massive explosions. Run, Marcus shouted. And we did. We sprinted down the tunnel, the sounds of collapse growing louder behind us. The air was thick with dust, making it hard to breathe. Several times one of us stumbled, only to be hauled back to our feet by the others. I lost track of time as we ran. My world narrowed down to the simple act of putting one foot in front of the other, of drawing one labored breath after another. Just when I thought my legs would give out, I saw a glimmer of light ahead. Daylight. We were almost out. With a final burst of speed, we threw ourselves forward, emerging from the tunnel into the cool forest air just as the ground gave one final, mighty heave. We scrambled away from the tunnel entrance, watching as it collapsed in on itself with a deafening roar. Trees toppled, the earth buckled, and then silence. We lay there on the forest floor, gasping for breath, for several long minutes. Finally, Marcus pushed himself to his feet. Sound off, he croaked. Still here, Cap, Liam mumbled. Alive somehow, I added. Slowly, painfully, we gathered ourselves and took stock of our situation. We were miles from where we had entered the bunker, with no gear except what we had on us. But we were alive. As we began the long trek back to civilization, I couldn't shake the memory of what we had seen in that bunker. The creatures, the experiments, the sense of ancient, otherworldly evil. It all seemed like a nightmare. But the ache in my muscles and the haunted looks in my companion's eyes told me it had all been terribly real. We never spoke publicly about what happened that day. Our mission was classified, the bunker's existence erased from all records. But sometimes in the dark of night, I still hear that unearthly humming, still see those twisted inhuman shapes moving in the shadows. And I wonder, did we really destroy them all? Or is something still down there, deep in the earth, waiting to be unleashed upon an unsuspecting world? Only time will tell. But whatever comes, I know this. The horrors we faced in those Maine woods changed us forever. And if the call ever comes again, I'll be ready. Because some evils are too great to be allowed to exist, no matter the cost to those who oppose them. This is Michael Martinez, signing off. Remember us, if the darkness ever rises again.